They say power corrupts, but that's the lie comfortable people tell themselves. The truth? Power reveals. And when King Draeven Kyle stood in the war chamber staring at a woman who'd once healed the dying, he didn't see corruption waiting to happen. He saw evolution. He saw a soul that could survive the fire he was about to throw her into. What he didn't see, what no king ever sees until it's too late, is that when you forge a weapon sharp enough to cut through anything, eventually it cuts through you too. This is the story of a man who thought he could engineer loyalty and the woman who proved him catastrophically wrong. Stay with me until the end. Drop a like and comment your city below. You're going to want to remember where you were when you heard this one. The screaming started 3 days before Lyra understood she was already dead. Not the dying kind of dead. The worst kind. The kind where your heart keeps beating, but every person who ever knew your name has decided you don't exist anymore. She'd worked in the eastern medical quarter of the capital for 6 years. 6 years of stitching farmers back together after thresher accidents. 6 years of brewing fever tonics for dock workers who couldn't afford real physicians. 6 years of being invisible in the exact way poor people are invisible in rich cities. Useful when bleeding, forgettable when healed. Then came the incident with the magistrate's son. The boy had been 14, drunk on his father's wine and his own invincibility. He'd tried to force himself on a serving girl in the alley behind Lyra's clinic. Lyra had been dumping wash water. She'd heard the girls cry. She'd acted without thinking. The iron poker she'd used to stoke her clinic fire had caught the boy across the temple. Not hard enough to kill. Hard enough to scar. Hard enough to matter. Within a day, the magistrate had her name. Within 2, he'd made it poison. The merchant stopped selling to her. Her landlord evicted her. The city guard started watching her door, waiting for an excuse. By the 3rd day, she understood. This was how they killed you without trial. They just erased you socially until starvation or desperation finished the job. Lyra sat in the remains of her clinic, surrounded by overturned shelves and shattered medicine bottles, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not breaking, hardening. She was 26 years old. She had no family, no coin, no future. She had nothing left to lose. That's the moment when people either surrender or become dangerous. Lyra stood up. The capital city of Kyle's empire, they called it Blackspire because the central citadel looked like a broken fang jutting from the earth, operated on a simple principle. Everything was for sale. Loyalty, silence, violence, flesh. You just needed to know the price and where to make the offer. Lyra had spent 6 years treating the kind of people who knew those prices intimately. She walked through the slaughter streets as the sun bled out across the horizon. This was where the butchers worked, where blood ran in the gutters in streams thick enough to draw flies in clouds. But it was also where the kingdom's unsanctioned business happened, the kind of business kings pretended not to know about while benefiting from the results. She found the man she was looking for in a tavern that smelled like rancid fat and human sweat. His name was Garen. Big as a bear, twice as mean, with scar tissue where most of his left ear used to be. He ran contract work for people who needed problems solved quietly. Lyra sat down across from him without asking. Garen looked up from his drink. His eyes were the color of dirty ice. "You lost, healer?" She met his stare without flinching. "I need work." Garen laughed. It sounded like grinding stones. "You're a woman. You're small. You got soft hands and you smell like chamomile. The fuck you think I'm gonna do with you? I know anatomy better than any butcher in this city. I know which cuts bleed fast and which ones bleed slow. I know how to make pain last and how to make it stop. And I got nothing left to go back to, which makes me more dangerous than half the men you employ." Garen stopped laughing. He studied her for a long moment. Then he pushed his drink aside. "You serious?" "Completely." He leaned back. "Most people come to me thinking they're hard. They ain't. First time they gotta do the work, they fold, they cry, they run. Then I gotta clean up their mess and they end up in the river. You understand what I'm saying?" Lyra didn't blink. "I understand that survival isn't pretty. I understand that the world doesn't care about fair. And I understand that right now, I'm more used to you alive than dead." Garen smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "All right, healer, let's see if you mean it." The test came that same night. Garen took her to a warehouse on the river docks. Inside, a man was tied to a chair. He was maybe 30. Bloodied, terrified. He'd stolen from someone who mattered, Garen explained. Now he needed to pay. Your job is simple. Make him hurt. Make him talk. Don't kill him yet. Garen handed her a knife. Lyra looked at the man in the chair. He was weeping, begging. She thought about the magistrate's son, about the serving girl who'd probably been discarded or worse, about the 6 years she'd spent trying to do good in a world that rewarded cruelty. She stepped forward. The man screamed. Lyra didn't. That was the first time she understood something fundamental about herself. She wasn't good. She'd just never been given permission to be anything else. But permission didn't matter anymore. What mattered was survival. And survival had teeth. She worked for Garen for 2 months. Small jobs at first. Debt collection. Intimidation. Then bigger things. Quietly removing people who'd become inconvenient to powerful men. Lyra learned quickly. Pain was a language, fear was a tool, and hesitation was the only thing that got you killed. But Garen wasn't her destination. He was a bridge. Because the entire time she was breaking bones and extracting confessions in warehouses, she was listening, gathering information, learning the real architecture of power in Blackspire. And every thread led back to the same place. The Citadel. King Draeven Kale. The man who ruled the empire with a precision that made other monarchs look like children playing with wooden swords. He didn't just conquer territories, he absorbed them, turned enemies into assets, transformed chaos into order. People said he didn't sleep, that he saw through walls, that he'd never lost a war because he ended conflicts before they began. People said a lot of things, but Lyra had learned to separate myth from method, and she wanted to understand the method, not to serve it, to survive it. One night, Garen called her to a meeting, private, just the two of them. They met in the same tavern where she'd first approached him. He looked different, tense, almost nervous. "I got a problem," he said. Lyra waited. "Someone's been asking about you. Someone from the Citadel." Her blood went cold. "They know about the magistrate's son?" Garen shook his head. "Worse. They know what you've been doing for me, and they want you." "For what?" He slid a sealed letter across the table. Black wax. The king's seal. Lyra stared at it like it might explode. "What does it say?" Garen's expression was unreadable. "It says you're conscripted, effective immediately. You report to the Citadel war chambers tomorrow at dawn, or you're declared an enemy of the throne." Her hands didn't shake when she picked up the letter. That surprised her. "Why me?" Garen shrugged. "Maybe someone noticed you got a talent for making people talk. Maybe they need a woman for something specific. Maybe the king's bored and wants fresh meat. I don't know and I don't ask. What I do know is when the Citadel calls, you go. Or you disappear." Lyra broke the seal. The letter was brief, written in handwriting so precise it looked like it had been carved rather than penned. Lyra Voss. "You have been selected for specialized service to the throne. Your skills have been evaluated. Your potential has been noted. Report to the Eastern Gate at dawn. Bring nothing. Expect everything to change. No signature." It didn't need one. Lyra folded the letter carefully. "What happens if I run?" Garen's face was grim. "Then I'm ordered to kill you. And if I don't, someone else will. The king doesn't make offers, healer. He makes inevitabilities." She sat in silence for a long moment. Then she stood. "I'll be there." Garen watched her go. He didn't say goodbye. Lyra spent that night in a rented room above a brothel. She didn't sleep. She sat by the window watching the Citadel's black towers cut silhouettes against the stars and wondered what kind of man sent letters like that. A man who saw people as tools, she decided, which meant he saw potential in her, which meant he had no idea what he was actually dealing with. Because Lyra had learned something in those 2 months working for Garen. She wasn't just good at hurting people. She was good at becoming whatever she needed to be to survive. And if the king wanted a tool, she'd be the sharpest blade he'd ever touched, right up until the moment she cut him with it. Dawn came cold and gray. Lyra walked to the Citadel's eastern gate wearing the same clothes she'd worn the night she'd killed her first man for Garen. Plain leather, dark fabric, nothing that would catch or tear. The guards were expecting her. They didn't speak, just gestured for her to follow. The Citadel's interior was nothing like she'd imagined. No gold, no tapestries, just stone and steel and the smell of oil and iron. Everything built for function, for war. They led her deep, down corridors that twisted like intestines, past training yards where soldiers drilled in silence, past armories that looked like they could outfit a nation. Finally, they stopped at a heavy iron door. One of the guards knocked twice. A voice from inside, low, controlled. "Send her in." The door opened. Lyra stepped through. The chamber beyond was circular, lit by a single brazier in the center. Maps covered the walls. Not decorative maps. Working maps. Battle plans. Supply routes. Territories marked in different colors. And at the far end of the room, standing with his back to her, was a man. He didn't turn around immediately. When he did, Lyra felt something she hadn't felt in months. Fear. Not because he was physically imposing. He was tall, lean, built like a blade himself. Dark hair cut military short. Face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as his citadel. Maybe 40. Maybe older. Hard to tell with men who'd spent their lives at war, but it wasn't his appearance that struck her. It was his eyes. They were the color of winter ice, and they looked at her the way a craftsman looks at raw material, evaluating, calculating, already deciding what she could become. Lyra Voss. His voice matched his eyes, cold, precise. She didn't respond, just held his gaze. He walked closer, circling her slowly. 2 months ago, you were a healer. Now you work for Garen the Cleaver, torturing debtors and disposing of inconvenient people. That's a significant evolution. Lyra kept her expression neutral. I adapted. Draeven stopped in front of her. To what? Reality. He studied her face. You're not afraid. Should I be? Most people are. When they're brought here. When they stand in front of me. They shake. They stammer. They try to please. You're doing none of those things. Lyra met his stare. Fear doesn't help me survive. Information does. So why am I here? Draeven smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd just confirmed a theory. You're here because I need something specific, something rare. Not strength. I have soldiers for that. Not intelligence. I have advisors. What I need is someone who can endure what would break most people. Someone who can be reshaped, reformed, turned into something precise and lethal, a weapon. He didn't deny it. Lyra felt her pulse quicken, but kept her voice steady. And if I refuse, then you'll be executed as an enemy of the throne, but you won't refuse. Why not? Because you're already what I need. You just don't know it yet. You've already killed. Already crossed lines most people can't even see. You've already chosen survival over morality. All I'm offering is a purpose for that choice. Lyra's jaw tightened. You don't know anything about me. Draeven moved closer. I know you attacked a magistrate's son to protect a servant girl. I know you spent 6 years healing people for free or near free. I know you have a conscience, and I know you've spent the last 2 months systematically dismantling it because the world didn't reward your kindness. That's not weakness. That's adaptability. And adaptability is the rarest trait in existence. He stopped inches from her. So here's the truth, Lyra. You can go back to Garen, work in warehouses, die in some gutter when you make a mistake or cross the wrong person. Or you can stay here. Let me teach you. Let me show you what you're actually capable of. Become something that matters. Something that changes the shape of empires. Lyra's breath came shallow. And what do you get out of it? Draeven's expression didn't change. A tool that can do what armies can't. Silence filled the space between them. Finally, Lyra spoke. If I do this, if I stay, I need to know one thing. Draeven waited. Can I leave? Ever? He considered the question, then he answered with an honesty that was somehow worse than a lie. No. Lyra felt the trap close around her, but she also felt something else. Opportunity. Because a trap only works if the prey doesn't understand it, and Lyra understood it perfectly. She nodded once. I'll stay. Draeven's expression shifted. Not satisfaction. Confirmation. Good. Training starts now. He turned toward the door. Lyra called after him. One more question. He paused. Why me? Specifically, there are others like me. Others who've done worse. Why choose me? Draeven looked back. Because when I had you investigated, I found something interesting. Every person you killed for Garen, you researched them first, found out what they'd done, made sure they deserved it. You didn't kill innocents, even when it would have been easier, even when no one would have known. He stepped closer again. That means you still have a conscience, which means you can still be broken, which means when I rebuild you, the foundation will hold. Cruelty is easy. Any animal can be cruel. But precision, control, that requires something deeper. And you have it. Lyra felt exposed, seen in a way that made her skin crawl. What if you're wrong? What if I can't be what you want? Draven's smile returned, colder this time. Then you'll die, and I'll find someone else. He walked out. Lyra stood alone in the chamber, surrounded by maps of conquered territories and the smell of burning coal. She'd survived poverty, survived assault, survived becoming a killer. Now she had to survive becoming a weapon. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a thought crystallized. If he thinks he can control me, he's already made his first mistake. Because control is just another word for underestimation. And underestimation, that's where the king dies and the weapon walks free. The training was worse than anything Lyra had imagined. Not because of physical pain, though there was plenty of that, but because Draven didn't train her body first. He trained her mind to betray itself. The first week, she wasn't allowed to fight, wasn't allowed to train with weapons. She was locked in a room with nothing but a chair and made to sit in silence for 16 hours a day. No food, no water, just silence. And Draven, watching from behind a one-way mirror she couldn't see but knew was there. On the third day, she started hallucinating. On the fifth, she broke the chair and tried to use the wood to pry open the door. On the seventh, she sat perfectly still and felt her mind separate from her body like oil from water. When they finally let her out, Draven was waiting. "What did you learn?" Lyra's voice was hoarse. "That you're a sadistic bastard." He didn't react. "What else?" "That I can survive longer than I think. That my mind is louder than I realized. That silence isn't empty. It's full of everything you're trying not to face." Draven nodded. "Good. Most people learn that in a month. You learned it in a week. That's why you're useful." The second week, they started the real work. Combat training. But not the kind soldiers received. Draven didn't teach her to fight armies. He taught her to fight individuals. Pressure points. Nerve clusters. How to kill someone with a 3-inch blade. How to make death look like accident or illness. How to read body language so precisely she could predict movement before it happened. Every day he brought in different opponents. Some were soldiers, some were assassins. Some were killers who'd worked in shadows for decades. Lyra lost every fight for the first month, but she learned from every loss. How to fall without breaking bones. How to breathe through broken ribs. How to keep moving when her body screamed for her to stop. Draven never comforted her, never encouraged. He just watched, analyzed, adjusted. "You're hesitating before strikes," he said one day after she'd been knocked unconscious for the second time. "Why?" Lyra spat blood. "I'm trying not to kill them." Wrong answer. You're trying to control the outcome. Control is an illusion. Commitment is real. When you strike, commit. The target lives or dies based on circumstance and anatomy, not your intention. Your job is precision, not morality. But no. Morality is a luxury for people with choices. You gave up choices when you walked through that door. Now you have purpose. That's better. That's cleaner. Lyra felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking. Hardening. She stood up. Again, Draven smiled. By the third month, Lyra stopped losing fights. By the sixth, she stopped thinking of them as fights at all. They were problems. Puzzles. Anatomical equations she solved with violence. Draven introduced new variables. Poisons. Explosives. Psychological manipulation. He made her study philosophy, strategy, history. Not to make her educated, to make her unpredictable. Because a weapon everyone understands is a weapon everyone can counter, he explained. But a weapon that thinks like a scholar, kills like an assassin, and operates like a ghost? That's the weapon that ends wars before they start. Lyra absorbed everything. Not because she wanted to please him, but because every skill was a key to a different door. And eventually, she'd need all those keys to escape. The first time Draven sent her on a real mission, she was terrified. not of the target, of herself. The mission was simple. A merchant lord named Corvain had been selling information to enemy kingdoms. Treaties, troop movements, weaknesses in supply lines. He needed to die, but not publicly. It had to look natural. Draven gave her 3 days. Lyra spent the first day researching. Corvain was cautious, had guards, tasters, slept in a locked room with 2 bodyguards outside. She spent the second day watching his routine. The third day, she acted. Corvain had a mistress, a young woman he visited twice a week in a rented townhouse. Lyra intercepted her, didn't kill her, just drugged her unconscious and took her place. When Corvain arrived, Lyra was waiting in the bed wearing the mistress's perfume. He didn't notice the difference until her blade was already in his kidney. She held him as he died, watched the light fade from his eyes, felt nothing. That was the part that scared her most. Not the killing, the absence of feeling. When she returned to the citadel, Draven was waiting. Did he suffer? No. Quick, clean. Draven studied her face. You feel guilty. Lyra met his eyes. No, that's the problem. I don't. He stepped closer. Good. Guilt is a chain. You've broken it. Now you're free. But Lyra didn't feel free. She felt like she was becoming exactly what he wanted. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. The next 2 years blurred together, mission after mission, target after target. Lyra became a ghost in Draven's empire, a whisper before the knife, the explanation for why rebellions collapsed and traitors vanished. The court started calling her the Shadow. The generals called her the King's Hand. Draven called her nothing, just looked at her with those ice-cold eyes and pointed at the next problem that needed erasing. And Lyra erased them. Perfectly. Efficiently. Until she stopped counting. But something was changing. Not in her missions. In him. Draven started keeping her close. Not just for briefings. For strategy sessions. For late-night discussions about the nature of power and the cost of empire. He talked to her like an equal, which was more dangerous than any weapon he'd ever given her. Because equality implied trust, and trust implied vulnerability. One night, after a particularly brutal mission that had required her to eliminate an entire family of conspirators, Lyra returned to find Draven in the war chamber. Alone, drinking. She'd never seen him drink before. He looked up when she entered. Is it done? Lyra nodded. All of them? Yes. Even the children. Lyra felt something twist in her chest. The youngest was 12. Old enough to remember. Old enough to seek revenge. So yes, even the children. Draven poured a second glass, pushed it toward her. She took it. They drank in silence. Finally, Draven spoke. Do you hate me? The question surprised her. Lyra considered lying, then decided truth was more interesting. Sometimes. He nodded. Good. Hatred means you're still capable of passion. I was worried I'd erase that. Why would that worry you? Because passion is what separates tools from forces. Tools break. Forces adapt. Lyra studied him. You want me to be a force? Draven met her eyes. I want you to be inevitable. The word hung in the air between them. Lyra felt something shift. Not attraction. Not yet. Recognition. 2 apex predators acknowledging each other across the same killing floor. What happens when I become that? She asked quietly. When I'm everything you designed me to be? Draven's expression didn't change. Then we see if I can still control you. It wasn't a threat, it was a challenge, and Lyra felt her pulse quicken, because for the first time since she'd walked through that iron door 3 years ago, she realized something. He wasn't just training her, he was testing himself, seeing how close he could push the blade before it cut him, and she was going to show him exactly how sharp she'd become. The mission that changed everything came 6 months later. Draven called her to the war chamber. 3 targets, 1 night. He laid out the details. Rebel leaders operating in the northern provinces, planning an uprising that could fracture the Empire's grain supply and trigger famine. Standard elimination. Except, the 3rd target was a woman named Alara Ven. Lyra knew that name. Alara had been a healer, like Lyra, worked in the same district. They'd never met, but they'd heard of each other. 2 women trying to do good in a world that didn't care. Lyra's hands didn't shake when she took the mission file. but something in her chest went cold. "Is there a problem?" Draven asked. Lyra looked up. "No." He studied her face. "You're lying. I said no." Draven stepped closer. "If you can't do this, I can. Then prove it." Lyra left without another word. She completed the first 2 targets by midnight. Quick, clean, professional. Then she went to find Alara. The woman was hiding in a farmhouse outside a village called Brennan's Cross. Lyra approached at dawn, found Alara in the barn, preparing to flee. They stood facing each other across the hay-strewn floor. Alara was older than Lyra expected, maybe 40, scarred, tired. She didn't run, just looked at Lyra with sad, knowing eyes. "You're the shadow." Lyra didn't respond. Alara smiled faintly. "I was like you once. Thought I could change things by working within the system. Healing people. Being useful. Then I realized the system doesn't want healers. It wants soldiers. So I became something else." "What?" "Someone who fights back." Lyra's hand moved to the blade at her hip. Alara didn't flinch. "He sent you because he knew you'd hesitate. Didn't he? Wanted to see if you'd break." Lyra's jaw tightened. "I don't break." "Everyone breaks. The question is what breaks you. For me, it was watching children starve while the king's granaries overflowed." "What about you?" Lyra pulled the blade. Alara's expression didn't change. "When you kill me, you need to understand something. You're not his weapon, you're his proof. Proof that he can take someone good and make them monstrous. Proof that control works. That's all you are to him." "Evidence." The words hit harder than any strike. Lyra stepped forward. Alara closed her eyes. "I hope you survive him, child. I really do." Lyra's blade moved, fast, precise, merciful. Alara dropped without a sound. And Lyra stood over the body, breathing hard, feeling something inside her crack wide open. Not guilt, clarity. Because Alara had been right about one thing. Draven hadn't sent her here to eliminate a rebel. He'd sent her here to see if she'd still obey when the target looked like who she used to be. This was a test, and she'd passed. But in passing, she'd learned something he didn't intend. He was afraid of her. Not afraid she'd fail. Afraid she'd evolve beyond his control, which many already knew. The weapon was becoming something else, something he couldn't predict. Lyra burned the farmhouse, made it look like an accident. Returned to the citadel as dawn broke across Blackspire's black towers. Draven was waiting in the war chamber. "Is it done?" Lyra met his eyes. All 3, clean, no witnesses. He studied her face for a long time. "You hesitated. It wasn't a question." Lyra didn't deny it, for a second. "Yes." "Why?" "Because she reminded me of who I was." "And?" Lyra stepped closer. "And I killed her anyway. Because who I was doesn't matter. Only who I am now." Draven's expression shifted. Something like approval, something like concern. "And who are you now, Lyra?" She held his gaze. "Whatever you made me." The silence stretched between them. Finally, Draven nodded. "Good. There's another mission, bigger, a village. Suspected rebellion, preemptive elimination." "How many?" 200, give or take." Lyra felt her pulse spike. "Children?" Draven's face was stone. "Everyone." For the first time in 3 years, Lyra paused. Not from fear, from calculation. Because this wasn't a test anymore. This was a line. And she had to decide. Cross it and become exactly what he wanted. A tool without limits. Or refuse and prove Alara right. Prove she was still human enough to break. Draven watched her internal war with those ice-cold eyes. Waiting, not commanding, giving her the choice, because that was the cruelest part. He'd always given her choices, just made sure every option led to the same place. Lyra took a breath. "When?" "Tomorrow night." Draven turned away. Dismissed. Lyra walked to the door, stopped, turned back. "What happens if I say no?" Draven didn't look at her. "Then I'll know I was wrong about you. And I don't like being wrong." His hand moved to the blade at his hip. Lyra understood. This wasn't a choice between obedience and freedom. It was a choice between becoming a monster or dying as a memory. She left without answering, spent the day preparing, sharpening blades, mixing accelerants, planning routes. But her mind was somewhere else, on a farmhouse, on a woman who'd looked at her with pity, on the realization that she'd become exactly what Draven intended. And that terrified her more than any mission ever had. Because monsters don't know they're monsters. They think they're survivors. Night fell. Lyra stood at the citadel gates, ready to ride north. Draven appeared beside her. "You're troubled." Lyra didn't look at him. "I'm fine." "You're lying." Again. She turned. They stood inches apart. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. "Really?" Draven's expression was unreadable. "I want to see how far you'll go, how much you can endure, how completely you'll commit. Why? Because if you can do this, if you can cross this line, then I'll know. Know what? That I've created something perfect, something that can't be broken, can't be turned, can't be stopped." Lyra felt her breath catch. "And if I can't? Then you're just another failed experiment. And I'll start over." The honesty was brutal, but it was also a confession. He needed her to be unbreakable, which meant he was afraid she wasn't, which meant she had power. She just had to figure out how to use it. Lyra mounted her horse, looked down at him. "I'll do the mission." Draven nodded. "But when I come back, we're going to talk." "About what?" "About what happens when your weapon decides it doesn't need you anymore." She rode into the darkness before he could respond. And Draven stood in the courtyard, watching her disappear, feeling something he hadn't felt in 20 years, uncertainty, because he'd trained her too well, made her too sharp, and now he was about to find out if he could still hold the blade, or if it was going to cut him apart. The village was called Raven's Hollow, population 217. Lyra counted them from the ridge overlooking the valley. Farmers mostly, a few craftsmen, children playing in the dirt streets even as the sun died behind the western mountains. They had no idea what was coming. She'd brought accelerants, enough to turn wood and thatch into an inferno that would spread faster than people could run. The plan was simple. Fire the northern edge first, drive them south toward the river, trap them against the water, finish anyone who made it through, clean, efficient, complete. Exactly how Draven had taught her. Lyra crouched in the darkness, watching smoke rise from cooking fires, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Doubt. Not moral doubt. She'd killed enough people that the numbers didn't matter anymore. 20 or 200, blood was blood. But tactical doubt, because this wasn't about eliminating a threat. This was about obedience. Draven was testing whether she'd crossed the final line, whether she'd become so committed to his vision that she'd burn innocent people alive just because he pointed at them. And that's when Lyra understood something fundamental. She'd been playing the wrong game. She'd been trying to survive him, when she should have been learning to replace him. Because a king who needs to test his weapon is a king who's already afraid of it. And fear is just another word for weakness. Lyra stood up, put the accelerants back in her pack, and rode down into the village. The first person she found was an old man sitting outside a cottage, smoking a pipe carved from horn. He looked up when she approached, didn't startle, just studied her with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "You're the shadow," he said. It wasn't a question. Lyra dismounted. "How did you know?" Old man smiled around his pipe. "Only two kinds of people ride into a place like this after dark. Travelers looking for shelter and killers looking for targets." "You don't look lost." Lyra felt a flicker of something. Not quite respect. Recognition, maybe. "You're right. I'm here to kill you." The old man nodded slowly. Figured as much. "King finally decided we're too much trouble, did he? You've been talking about rebellion. Talking ain't doing. But kings don't care about the difference, do they?" Lyra studied him. "You're not afraid. I'm 83 years old, buried 2 wives and 5 children." Fear stopped making sense a long time ago. He took another draw from his pipe. "So you gonna do it quick, or you one of the ones that likes to make a show?" Lyra sat down beside him. The old man's eyebrows rose. "I need information," she said. "About what?" "This rebellion you're supposedly planning. Is it real, or is someone using you?" The old man laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. "Girl, we're farmers. We got no rebellion. We got complaints. We got hunger. We got taxes so high we're eating our seed grain to survive. But rebellion? That takes organization, leadership, hope. We got none of those things. Then why does the king think you're a threat? The old man spat into the dirt. Because 6 weeks ago, a merchant came through, started asking questions, stirring people up, talking about how things could be different, how we didn't have to starve while the capital feasted. Then he left. Week later, the tax collectors came, found pamphlets, anti-monarchy stuff. Suddenly we're traitors. Lyra felt her blood go cold. This merchant, what did he look like? Tall, thin, had a scar across his jaw. Dressed too nice to be a real traitor. That was one of Draeven's intelligence officers. Lyra knew because she'd worked with him before. The pieces clicked together. This wasn't a preemptive strike against rebellion. This was manufactured justification. Draeven had sent someone to plant evidence, create the appearance of conspiracy, then sent Lyra to erase the evidence by erasing the village. Not because they were dangerous, because he needed to prove to himself that she'd kill anyone he pointed at, even the innocent. The old man watched her face change. You didn't know, did he? Lyra stood up. How many people in this village actually want to fight the crown? Maybe 10. Hotheads, young, angry. They talk big, but they ain't got the spine for real violence. Where are they? The old man hesitated. Lyra met his eyes. I'm not going to kill them, but I need to know. Why should I trust you? Because if I wanted you dead, you'd already be bleeding. Now tell me. The old man pointed toward a barn at the edge of the village. They meet there, planning some kind of demonstration. Gonna refuse to pay the next tax levy. Think it'll inspire others. Lyra felt a grim understanding settle in her chest. Demonstrations didn't threaten empires, but they made useful propaganda. Kill them, claim they attack tax collectors, and suddenly the whole kingdom sees why the king's methods are necessary. She'd been played, but more importantly, Draeven had made a mistake. He'd given her information he didn't intend to. He'd shown her how he manipulated narratives, which meant she could do the same thing to him. Lyra turned to the old man. Listen carefully. In 1 hour, riders are going to come. King's soldiers. They're going to ask where the rebels are. You're going to tell them they fled north 3 days ago, heard rumors of a crackdown and ran. Understood? Why would I lie for you? Because if you don't, everyone here dies. If you do, you might survive long enough to see something change. The old man studied her. You're breaking with him, aren't you? The king. Not yet, but soon. What changed? Lyra looked toward the mountains where the citadel's black towers cut the sky. I realized he doesn't want a weapon. He wants a mirror. Someone who will reflect his brutality back at him so he can call it necessary. I'm done being his justification. She mounted her horse. The old man called after her. If you're going to fight him, you better be ready. Men like that don't let go of power. They burn the world before they surrender it. Lyra looked back. Then I'll make sure I'm the one holding the torch. She rode out of Raven's Hollow as the moon rose, didn't look back. Behind her, the village slept, unburned, alive. And for the first time in 3 years, Lyra felt something she'd forgotten existed. Choice. Not the illusion of choice Draeven gave her. Real choice. The kind that comes with consequences. And she was ready to pay them. The ride back to Blackspire took 2 days. Lyra used the time to think, not about what she'd done, about what came next. Because refusing a direct order from the king was treason, and treason meant death, unless she could make Draeven believe she'd succeeded, which meant she needed proof, evidence that Raven's Hollow was ash. She stopped at a burnt-out farmstead 20 miles south of the village, a place that had been destroyed months ago in a border raid, the bones of buildings still smoldering in places. Lyra spent 6 hours collecting ash, charred wood, fragments of bone from livestock that had burned alive. She put them in bags marked with Raven's Hollow's regional seal, created a manifest, casualties, confirmed kills, resistance encountered, made it look real. Because the thing about kings is they rarely verify their own atrocities. They just need the paperwork to justify them. When Lyra rode through the citadel gates at dawn on the 3rd day, she was exhausted. But her story was solid. She found Draeven in the war chamber. He was standing over a map of the northern provinces, marking something in red ink. He didn't look up when she entered. Is it done? Lyra dropped the bags on his table. Ash scattered across the map. 217. No survivors. Draven's hand stopped moving. He looked at the ash, then at her. You're certain? I burned it until there was nothing left to identify. Then I salted the field so nothing would grow. You wanted preemptive elimination. You got it. She kept her voice flat, emotionless. Draven studied her face for a long moment. You look tired. I am. But satisfied? Lyra met his eyes. I stopped feeling satisfaction after the first 50 people. Draven. Now I just feel empty, which I assume is what you wanted. The room went silent. Then Draven did something unexpected. He smiled. Not the cold, calculating smile she'd seen 1,000 times. Something almost genuine. You passed. Lyra's chest tightened. Passed what? The final test. I needed to know if you'd commit completely, if you'd crossed the line that separates soldiers from legends. And you did. He stepped closer. You're ready now for what? Everything. Draven gestured to the map. There's a war coming, not with external kingdoms, internal. The nobility is fracturing. Lords who think they can challenge me because I've been focused on expansion instead of consolidation. They're wrong, but they need to be shown why. And you want me to show them. Draven's eyes glinted. I want you to be the reason they wake up screaming. The thing they can't plan for, can't predict, can't stop. I want you to become the Empire's nightmare made flesh. Lyra felt her pulse quicken. This was it, the moment he gave her real power, which meant it was also the moment she could take everything from him, but she couldn't show that, not yet. So she nodded. Tell me who dies first. Draven's smile widened. Lord Varen Hulk. Lyra felt her blood freeze. Varen was Draven's oldest ally, the man who'd helped him take the throne, the architect of half his military victories. Why Varen? Because he's been meeting with other lords, quietly, discussing alternatives. He thinks I don't know. He thinks he's being careful, but I know everything that happens in this empire. Draven moved to the window. Varen taught me that power isn't held through loyalty. It's held through inevitability. People follow you because the alternative is unthinkable. He's forgotten that lesson. Started believing in sentiment, in old bonds. He turned back to Lyra. I need him to remember what inevitability looks like. You want him dead. No, I want him broken, publicly. I want every lord who's been whispering in corners to see what happens when you question me. And I want you to be the instrument of that lesson. Lyra kept her expression neutral. Inside, her mind was racing. Because Varen wasn't just Draven's ally. He was the only person in the Empire who could challenge him politically. If Draven was willing to destroy Varen, it meant he'd decided absolute power was more important than strategic alliances, which meant he was becoming unstable. And unstable kings make mistakes. How do you want it done? Lyra asked. Draven handed her a file. 3 days from now, Varen is hosting a gathering, 50 nobles, a celebration of his granddaughter's betrothal. Public. Prestigious. Everyone who matters will be there. Including you? Draven shook his head. I'll be conspicuously absent, occupied with border negotiations. That's the point. Varen thinks I'm distracted. He's planning to use the gathering to solidify alliances against me. And you want me to interrupt? I want you to make an example, not of Varen himself, of his guests. I want you to kill 3 of the most influential lords in that room, publicly, brutally. Make it clear that proximity to rebellion is the same as rebellion. Then leave Varen alive to explain to everyone else why their friends are dead. Lyra felt a chill run through her. This wasn't strategy. This was paranoia. Draven was eliminating potential threats before they became real, which meant he was afraid. And fear made even brilliant men predictable. I'll need access, Lyra said. Security will be heavy. Draven pulled a second document from his desk. You'll go as Lady Marin Krell, minor nobility from the eastern provinces, recently widowed, looking to establish new alliances. I've already arranged your invitation. Lyra took the papers. 3 targets. In front of 50 witnesses. That's not subtle. Subtlety is weakness. I want everyone in that room to understand that I can reach them anywhere, anytime, through anyone. Even through you? The words were out before Lyra could stop them. Draven's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Are you questioning me?" Lyra held his gaze. "I'm questioning the strategy. If you eliminate too many allies, you'll be ruling through fear alone. Fear works, but it's fragile. The moment you show weakness, it collapses." Draven stepped closer. They were inches apart now. "I don't show weakness. Everyone does eventually." His hand moved to her throat. Not violently, just resting there. A reminder. "Are you planning to be the one who exposes mine?" Lyra didn't flinch. "If I was planning to betray you, would I tell you?" Draven's fingers tightened slightly. "No. You do what you always do. Obey perfectly, until the moment you strike. Then you already know the answer." They stood like that for a long moment. Finally, Draven released her. "Do the mission. Prove I'm right to trust you." Lyra turned toward the door. "And if you're wrong," Draven's voice followed her, "then one of us won't survive the realization." Lyra left the war chamber with her heart hammering. Not from fear, from recognition. They both knew what was happening. The weapon was evolving beyond the hand that wielded it. The only question was when the blade would turn, and who would bleed first. The next 3 days, Lyra prepared. Not just for the mission, for what came after. Because killing 3 lords in front of witnesses wasn't the problem. The problem was that Draven had chosen targets who weren't actually conspirators. She'd checked, used her network of informants, confirmed that the 3 men Draven wanted dead had been loyal, supportive, no secret meetings, no whispered alliances. They were innocent, or as innocent as nobility ever got. Draven was inventing threats to justify eliminating potential future problems, which meant the Empire was eating itself. And Lyra had a choice. Become the instrument of that cannibalization, or become the knife that cut the cancer out. She chose the latter. The gathering was held in Varine's estate outside the capital, a sprawling compound of white stone and manicured gardens that smelled like roses and old money. Lyra arrived as Lady Maren Krell, dressed in mourning black with silver thread, hair pulled back, face painted pale, the picture of a widow seeking comfort and new connections. No one questioned her. Rich people never did when you looked like you belonged. The ballroom was massive, crystal chandeliers, music from a string quartet, servants moving through crowds with wine and delicacies, 50 nobles dressed in their best, laughing and scheming in equal measure. Lyra moved through them like a ghost, studying, listening, identifying. Her 3 targets were easy to spot. Lord Corman Vex, overweight, loud, telling stories about his hunting prowess while servants nodded politely. Lord Silas Orne, thin, nervous, clutching a wine glass like it was a shield. Lord Tavin Grail, young, arrogant, surrounded by sycophants who laughed at every word. None of them looked like threats. They looked like men enjoying a party. Lyra found Varen near the center of the room. He was older than she expected, maybe 65. Gray hair, sharp eyes, the kind of man who'd spent his life reading people and situations. He noticed her immediately. Lady Krell. "I'm pleased you could attend." Lyra curtsied. "The honor is mine, Lord Hulk. Your hospitality is renowned." Varen smiled. It was genuine, warm. "Come, let me introduce you to some people who might be useful to a young widow establishing herself." He led her through the crowd, introduced her to merchants, minor lords, people who might help her fictional persona build connections. And the entire time, Lyra watched him, saw no conspiracy, no malice, just an old man celebrating his granddaughter's happiness. This was the threat Draven wanted eliminated, not because it was real, but because it might become real. And that's when Lyra made her final decision. She wasn't going to kill these men. She was going to expose why Draven wanted them dead. At midnight, the crowd gathered for the betrothal announcement. Varen stood at the center of the ballroom with his granddaughter, a girl of maybe 16, nervous, beautiful, holding hands with a young man who looked terrified and honored in equal measure. Varen raised his glass. Friends, family. Tonight we celebrate not just a union of 2 hearts, but the continuation of bonds that make our society strong. In times of war and uncertainty, it is love and loyalty that sustain us. The crowd murmured agreement. Lyra stood at the edge of the room, her hand on the blade concealed in her dress. This was the moment. Do what Draven commanded, or do what was right, and for the first time in 3 years, she chose right. Lyra stepped forward. The crowd parted. She walked directly to Varen. He looked at her with mild curiosity. Lady Krell? Lyra pulled the blade. Gasps erupted, but she didn't strike Varen. She held the knife where everyone could see it. Then she spoke, loud, clear. My name is not Maren Krell. It's Lyra Voss. I am the Shadow, the King's weapon, and I was sent here tonight to kill 3 men. The room exploded into chaos, shouting, movement toward exits. Varen raised his hand. The authority in the gesture was absolute. Everyone froze. He looked at Lyra, his expression unreadable. Why haven't you? Because they're innocent, and I'm done being the knife that cuts down innocent people to satisfy a paranoid king. Varen's eyes widened slightly. You're defying a direct order. I'm choosing truth over obedience. Draven sent me here to kill Lord Vex, Lord Born, and Lord Grael. Not because they've conspired against him, but because he's decided loyalty isn't enough anymore. He wants absolute submission, and anyone who might question him, even hypothetically, is now a target. Silence filled the ballroom. 50 nobles staring at her, understanding dawning on their faces. If the king was willing to eliminate his own allies preemptively, none of them were safe. Varen stepped closer to Lyra. You realize what you've just done? Started a war. Varen studied her. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. Good. It's about time someone did. He turned to the crowd. King Draeven has ruled through strength and strategy for 20 years. I helped him take that throne. I believed in his vision. But vision without restraint becomes tyranny, and I will not watch this empire devour itself because one man has decided fear is easier than trust. He looked back at Lyra. You've shown remarkable courage, but courage alone won't survive what comes next. If you're truly breaking with the king, you'll need allies. I don't want allies. I want the truth exposed. Varen shook his head. The truth won't matter if Draven crushes you before anyone hears it. You need protection, resources, strategy. Why would you help me? Because you just proved something I've suspected for years. Draven's methods create loyalty through fear. But fear always breaks eventually, and when it does, the strongest force wins. He extended his hand. Help me end this. Not through assassination, through revolution. Lyra stared at his hand. This wasn't what she'd planned. She'd planned to expose Draven, maybe die in the attempt, not start a civil war. But looking around the ballroom at 50 faces that had gone from celebration to calculation in minutes, she understood. She'd already started it. The question was whether she'd lead it or be consumed by it. Lyra took Varen's hand. The crowd erupted into motion. Not fleeing, planning. Because revolution doesn't start with armies. It starts with a single person refusing to kill when ordered. And in that refusal, showing everyone else that refusal is possible. Outside the estate, in the darkness beyond the garden walls, 3 of Draven's agents watched through scopes. They'd been sent to observe, confirm the kills, report back. One of them lowered his scope. She didn't do it. The second agent cursed. What do we do? The third was already moving. We tell the king, and then we prepare for war. They rode hard toward Blackspire. Behind them, the estate blazed with light and furious planning. And in the center of it all, Lyra stood with a blade in her hand and the weight of an empire's future on her shoulders. She'd crossed the line Draven had drawn, not because she wanted to destroy him, but because she'd finally understood what he'd been too brilliant and too broken to see. Power built on fear is just a slower form of suicide, and she refused to be the bullet he used to kill himself, even if it meant becoming the weapon that killed him instead. Back in the Citadel, Draven received the message at dawn. He read it once, then burned it. Stood at the window of his war chamber, watching the sun rise over Blackspire's towers. His face showed nothing, but his hand, resting on the window frame, was white-knuckled. Behind him, his military commander cleared his throat. Your orders, my king. Draven didn't turn around. Mobilize the southern legions. Lock down the capital. Arrest anyone associated with Varen Hulk. And put a price on Lyra Voss's head. 100,000 gold. Alive. The commander hesitated. Alive, my lord? Draven's reflection in the glass was cold. I made her. I'll be the one who unmakes her. But first, she needs to understand the consequences of defiance. He turned. Send word to every lord in the empire. Anyone who harbors her is guilty of treason. Anyone who aids Varen's rebellion will be executed along with their families. And make it clear, this isn't a war. What is it? Draven's smile was terrible. An education. I'm going to teach the entire kingdom what happens when you mistake mercy for weakness. The commander saluted and left. Draven stood alone in the war chamber, surrounded by maps of territories he'd conquered, strategies he'd perfected, victories he'd engineered, and for the first time in 20 years he felt something he'd spent his entire life eliminating. Fear. Not of losing, of being wrong, because if Lyra had truly broken free of his control, if she'd evolved beyond what he'd designed, then he'd created the one thing that could destroy him. Not an enemy, a reflection. Someone who understood his methods because he'd taught them to her. Someone who knew his weaknesses because she'd been forced to study them. Someone who could dismantle his empire from the inside because she'd helped build it. Draven looked at the map of his kingdom, saw it differently now, not as conquered territory, as a chessboard. And Lyra had just moved into position to claim checkmate. He'd spent 3 years forging her into a weapon. Now he had to discover if the blacksmith could survive the blade, or if he'd been signing his own death warrant every time he'd pushed her to become something stronger than him. The war chamber door opened. An advisor entered, pale, shaking. "My lord, there's news from the northern provinces." "Speak." "Raven's Hollow, the village you ordered destroyed." "What about it?" "It's still standing. Your scouts confirmed it. Population intact, no signs of fire or attack." Draven's blood went cold. She lied. The advisor nodded. "For how long?" The advisor swallowed. "Based on the timeline, since the beginning. She never intended to complete the mission." Draven felt something crack in his chest. Not anger, devastation. Because the lie wasn't just about the village. It was about everything. Every mission, every test, every moment he'd believed she was his. She'd been playing him, learning, adapting, waiting, and he'd been too arrogant to see it. "Get out," Draven said quietly. The advisor fled. Draven stood alone. Then he did something he hadn't done since the day he'd taken the throne. He laughed. It was a broken sound, the laugh of a man who just realized he'd engineered his own destruction. Because Lyra hadn't just defied him. She'd become better than him. And that was unforgivable. Not because it was wrong, but because it proved he'd succeeded. He'd created something perfect, something that didn't need him anymore. And now that creation was going to show him exactly how sharp he'd made her. The rebellion lasted exactly 6 days before Lyra realized she'd been played from the beginning. That's the thing about revolutions nobody warns you about. They don't collapse because the enemy is stronger. They collapse because the foundation was rotten before the first battle even started. And Lyra was about to learn that lesson carved into her bones with a blade made of betrayal. The first crack appeared on day 3. Varen's estate had swollen with bodies. 50 nobles became 100, then 200, then so many that servants started running out of rooms to house them. Lords arriving with private armies, merchants bringing coin, minor nobility dragging ancient grudges wrapped in the language of justice. They called it a coalition. Lyra called it a feeding frenzy. She watched them argue in Varen's war room, like wolves fighting over a carcass that hadn't died yet. The old lord stood at the head of the table, trying to maintain order while chaos bloomed around him like infection. "We need defensive positions," Varen insisted. "Fortify the eastern provinces. Make Draven overextend his supply lines. Force him to—" Lord Corman Vex slammed his fist on the table. His jowls shook with righteous fury that looked practiced, rehearsed. "Defensive positions are for cowards. We strike the capital. Show the people their god-king bleeds red like everyone else." "The capital has 30,000 soldiers," Varen said slowly, like he was explaining basic arithmetic to a child. "We have maybe 8,000. The numbers don't work. Numbers are for merchants counting coin. War is about will. And we got the will right now. Every hour we waste is an hour Draven uses to turn sentiment against us. He's already turned sentiment against us. Our families are imprisoned, our land seized, we're labeled traitors across every province. What we need is time to build actual... Time gets us killed." The argument spiraled, other lords choosing sides based on territorial disputes that predated Draven's reign by generations. Voices rising. Old hatreds surfacing like bodies in a thawing lake. Lyra stood in the corner watching the whole thing disintegrate, and she understood something that made her blood go cold. These men didn't want to defeat Draven. They wanted to replace him. They were already fighting over who'd wear the crown before they'd even taken it off his head. This wasn't revolution. This was succession crisis dressed up in the language of liberation. After the meeting collapsed into shouting matches and thinly veiled threats, Varen found Lyra on the eastern balcony. The old lord looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 days. His shoulders carried weight that hadn't been there before. They're going to tear this apart before we ever face him, aren't they? Lyra didn't insult him with comfort. Yes. Varen gripped the balcony railing, knuckles white. I spent 40 years navigating noble politics, building alliances, learning how to unite people toward common purpose. Turns out I only knew how to make them afraid of the same enemy. That's all unity ever is. Shared fear, shared enemy. Remove those and people remember they hate each other. Then how did Draven hold the Empire together for 2 decades? Lyra watched the distant mountains where Blackspire's towers cut the horizon, because he made himself the only thing worth fearing. Everyone else was too busy surviving him to fight each other. He didn't unite the Empire. He suppressed everything that wasn't him. So we're doing this wrong, completely wrong. Varen turned to face her. What would you do differently? Something you won't like hearing. Try me. Stop trying to build a coalition. Stop pretending this is about noble principles and righteous causes. Start building a knife sharp enough to cut Draven's throat before these lords eat each other alive. Varen flinched. You're talking about assassination. I'm talking about reality. You want revolution? Revolution takes years, decades, building institutions, changing hearts and minds. We've got weeks at most before this coalition implodes, so we do what actually works. Targeted elimination, command structure, key supporters, intelligence networks. Make him weak enough that when the lords finally turn on each other, Draven's too broken to capitalize on it. That's becoming exactly what he made you. No, that's using what he made me to unmake him. There's a difference. Is there? Lyra met his eyes. Guess we'll find out. That night, Lyra started planning, not with Varen's generals who spent more time arguing about tactics than implementing them, not with the noble coalition that couldn't agree on what color the sky was, alone. Because Draven had taught her one lesson better than any other. Trust is a luxury. Luxury gets you killed. The only person you can truly rely on is yourself. She identified 7 targets. Draven's master of coin who controlled the Empire's financial infrastructure. His chief intelligence officer who ran the network of spies and informants. 3 generals commanding critical legions stationed around the capital. The magistrate controlling Blackspire's garrison. And 1 more. Cara Dane. The name sat in Lyra's mind like a blade waiting to drop. Cara was Draven's insurance policy. The weapon he'd kept in reserve while Lyra had been his active instrument. Younger by 5 years. Faster. Meaner. Less burdened by the conscience Lyra had spent 3 years trying to carve out of herself. They'd crossed paths during training, sized each other up the way apex predators do when they share territory. Never friends. Never enemies. Just 2 weapons acknowledging each other's sharpness. If Lyra moved against Draven's infrastructure, Cara would be the blade sent to stop her, which meant Cara had to die first. The logic was clean, simple, necessary. Lyra just had to ignore the part of her that remembered what it felt like to be the younger weapon, the one still believing obedience equaled purpose. She left the estate at midnight without telling anyone. The ride to Blackspire took 8 hours, pushing her horse harder than she should have. The animal was lathered and stumbling by the time she reached the outer checkpoints. The capital looked different now. Draven had locked it down tight. Checkpoints every half mile. Soldiers patrolling in groups of 8 instead of 4. Wanted posters with Lyra's face sketched in charcoal nailed to every public post. 100,000 gold for her capture. Alive. That one word told her everything about Draven's state of mind. He didn't want her dead. He wanted her broken, publicly. A demonstration to anyone considering defiance that mercy was weakness and rebellion was suicide. Lyra smiled in the darkness. He'd have to catch her first. She entered the city through the sewer system. Routes she'd memorized 2 years ago during a mission that required knowing every way in and out of Blackspire. The tunnels smelled like 3 centuries of human waste and industrial runoff, but they got her past the checkpoints. She emerged in the merchant district an hour before dawn. Streets empty except for bakers firing ovens and dock workers stumbling toward the river with hangovers and regrets. Lyra moved through shadows like she was made of them, found the building she needed. An anonymous townhouse 3 blocks from the central market. Nondescript. Forgettable. The kind of place you'd walk past 1,000 times without noticing. Kara's safe house. Lyra had discovered it 18 months ago during a mission requiring her to know where Draeven's other weapons slept. She'd filed the information away. Never told him she knew. Information was currency, and you never spent it unless the return justified the cost. Now the cost was worth it. She picked the lock with tools that felt like old friends in her hands. The mechanism yielded with a soft click that sounded like a confession in the pre-dawn silence. Inside the safe house was exactly what she expected. Sparse. Functional. Weapons mounted on every wall in easy reach. Maps marked with operational zones. Reports stacked in neat piles. And in the bedroom, asleep in a bed that smelled like weapon oil and leather, was Cara Dane. Lyra stood in the doorway. Blade already in her hand. This would be simple. Quick. Cara wouldn't even wake up. One cut across the carotid, and the threat would be eliminated before it became active. But something stopped her. Not mercy. Lyra had killed too many people for mercy to mean much anymore. Curiosity. Because looking at Cara asleep, face relaxed in a way it never was during waking hours, Lyra saw a mirror, a reflection of who she'd been 3 years ago, a tool that existed only to serve someone else's vision of order. And she wondered, if someone told Cara the truth about what Draeven really was, what he did, how he manufactured threats to justify eliminating potential problems before they became actual problems, would she still serve him, or would she make the same choice Lyra had made? It was a stupid question, sentimental, the kind of thinking that got operatives killed in the field. But Lyra couldn't silence it. She lowered the blade slightly, made a choice that defied every tactical instinct she'd developed, and spoke. Wake up. Cara's eyes snapped open. No confusion, no disorientation, no slow emergence from sleep. Pure combat readiness and half a heartbeat. Her hand shot toward the knife she kept under her pillow. Lyra was faster, kicked the bed frame hard enough to send it sliding. Cara rolled off the opposite side, already moving into defensive position. They faced each other across the wrecked bed. Cara's expression was arctic. You got a death wish walking in here? Maybe. Or maybe I got a better offer for you. Cara laughed. It sounded like breaking glass. You think I'm going to defect? Join your pathetic little rebellion that's already falling apart? How do you know it's falling apart? Because Draeven's got 3 agents inside Varen's inner circle feeding him everything. He's known every move you've planned before you planned it. Your coalition is infiltrated top to bottom. You're already dead. You just don't know it yet. The words hit Lyra like physical blows, but she kept her face neutral. If that's true, why hasn't he moved against us? Cara circled left. Lyra mirrored the movement. They were both reading angles, calculating distances, preparing for violence that felt inevitable. Because he's letting you gather everyone stupid enough to oppose him in one place. Then he'll crush all of you at once. Maximum efficiency. Minimum resistance afterward. It's brilliant, really. Lyra felt the trap closing around her throat, but she couldn't process it yet, had to deal with the immediate threat first. You still didn't answer my question, Lyra said. Why serve him? What's he giving you that's worth being his puppet? Purpose. Power. The chance to be something that matters instead of nothing that doesn't. You think you matter to him? I know I do. I'm his insurance, his fail-safe, the weapon that works when other weapons break. Cara smiled. It was sharp enough to cut. Like you broke. I didn't break. I evolved. Into a traitor, into someone who thinks for herself. Same thing. Cara lunged. The fight was savage. They'd trained under the same master, knew the same techniques, could anticipate each other's strikes because they'd been forged in the same fire. Blade met blade with sounds like screaming metal. Blood met blood. They crashed through furniture and shattered glass and painted the walls with violence that felt personal in ways combat rarely did. Lyra was older, more experienced, had survived situations that should have killed her, but Cara was hungrier, angrier, fighting with the certainty of someone who still believed obedience equaled righteousness. They were equally matched, which meant the fight would come down to who wanted survival more. Lyra got Kara's blade away first, sent it skittering across the floor, slammed the younger woman against the wall hard enough to crack plaster, got her own knife to Kara's throat, both of them heaving for breath, bleeding from a dozen cuts, staring at each other with expressions that mixed hate and recognition. Kara smiled through split lips. Do it. Prove you're everything Draeven said you were. A traitor. A coward. A weapon that turned on its master because it was too weak to... I'm not killing you. The words surprised them both. Kara's eyes widened. What? Lyra stepped back, lowered the blade. Her hand shook slightly from adrenaline dump and something else she couldn't name. I came here to eliminate a threat. But you're not the threat. Draeven is. And killing you just makes me more like him. I'm done being what he made me. You're weak. Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally strong enough to choose something other than violence when violence is easy. You're going to regret this. Probably. Lyra walked toward the door, stopped when Kara called out. Why? Why really? Lyra looked back. Because 3 years ago, someone gave me a choice between dying as a healer or surviving as a killer. I chose survival. And it cost me everything that made survival worth it. Maybe if someone had given me a different choice back then, I'd have taken a different path. I'm giving you that choice now. What choice? To think for yourself. To ask whether serving Draeven is actually giving you purpose or just convincing you that purpose requires a master. Kara said nothing. Lyra left. She made it 3 blocks before the ambush hit. 20 soldiers materialized from alleys and doorways, surrounding her in a plaza near the Fountain District, moving with precision that spoke of planning and preparation. They'd been waiting, which meant Kara had signaled them before Lyra even arrived, which meant Lyra's mercy had been rewarded with exactly what mercy always gets rewarded with: betrayal. The commander stepped forward, sword already drawn, face hard as coffin nails. Lyra Voss, by order of King Draeven Kale, you're under arrest for treason, desertion, conspiracy against the throne, and attempted regicide. Surrender peacefully, and you'll be treated according to law. Lyra looked at 20 armed soldiers in formation, calculated the odds of fighting through them, came up with numbers that didn't justify the attempt. She could kill maybe 4 before they overwhelmed her, 5 if she got lucky, 6 if she was willing to die in the process. But dying here accomplished nothing. So she did what survival required, dropped her weapons, raised her hands. The soldiers moved in fast, shackled her wrists behind her back, ankles chained close enough to prevent running, searched her thoroughly and found 7 hidden blades she'd placed exactly where they'd look for them. They missed the 8th blade, the one sewn into her belt lining. Small victory, probably meaningless, but she'd take it. As they marched her toward the citadel, Lyra looked back once, saw Kara standing in a window of the safe house, watching. Their eyes met across the distance, and Lyra saw something in the younger woman's expression that surprised her. Not triumph, guilt. But guilt doesn't undo consequences. It just makes them hurt worse when they land. The Citadel's dungeons were exactly as Lyra remembered them. Cold, dark, smelling like old blood and older despair. Stone walls that wept moisture. Chains designed to hold people in positions that stayed just short of torture but guaranteed maximum discomfort. They locked her in a cell built for high-value prisoners, left her chained to the wall for 8 hours without water or explanation. Standard protocol. Let the prisoner's imagination work on them. Let fear and thirst and darkness do preliminary work before interrogation even started. Lyra had used these tactics herself dozens of times, knew they were coming, didn't make them easier to endure. When the door finally opened, she expected Draeven, got Varen instead. The old lord looked destroyed, face swollen with bruises, limping badly, hands bound behind his back, blood crusted in his gray hair. They threw him into the cell like garbage. He hit the stone floor with sounds that made Lyra wince. "What are you doing here?" Varen coughed. Blood came up. Turns out 3 of my most trusted generals were Draeven's agents. They waited until I'd committed most of my forces to defensive positions in the east. Then they struck from inside, killed my officers, seized my command structure, rounded up the coalition leadership before anyone understood what was happening. How many captured? 47 lords. Their families imprisoned, assets seized. Your rebellion lasted 6 days, Lyra. 6 days before it was crushed so completely, it's like it never existed. The words felt like blows landing on already broken ribs. Where's the army? Scattered, leaderless. Most surrendered when word spread that leadership was captured. The rest are being hunted through the provinces as we speak. By tomorrow, there won't be enough resistance left to fill a tavern. Lyra closed her eyes. She'd failed, not just tactically, but at every strategic level. She'd underestimated Draeven's preparation, his reach, his willingness to sacrifice short-term stability for long-term control. And now they were both going to pay prices that made death look generous. I'm sorry, Varen said quietly. For what? For convincing you this could work. For believing we could outmaneuver a man who spent 20 years perfecting control. For dragging you into a doomed... You didn't drag me anywhere. I walked in with my eyes open. Because I gave you hope. False hope. Lyra looked at him. Hope wasn't false. We just ran out of time before we ran out of mistakes. The door opened again. This time Draeven entered. He looked different, thinner, harder, like someone had taken everything soft and burned it out of him until only the framework remained. His eyes found Lyra immediately, and for a long moment they just stared at each other across the cell. Creator and creation, king and weapon, architect and ruin. Finally Draeven spoke. His voice was quiet, controlled, which somehow made it more terrible than screaming would have been. You cost me 6,000 soldiers, 47 noble families, 2 provinces temporarily destabilized, 3 years of careful planning, and something I can't quantify but feels more expensive than all of it combined. Lyra met his gaze without flinching. You cost me my humanity. I'd say we're even. Draeven smiled. It looked like someone had taught his face the expression without explaining what it meant. Humanity. That's what you think you lost? That's what you took. He stepped closer. I didn't take anything. I revealed what was already there. You were always capable of violence, of ruthlessness, of choosing survival over morality. I just gave you permission to stop pretending otherwise. You made me a monster. No. I made you honest. The monster was always there. I just taught it how to hunt. Lyra felt rage building in her chest like pressure in a sealed vessel. You turned me into a weapon, and you became the best weapon I ever created. So good you almost destroyed everything I built. That's not my failure, that's my success. You exceeded specifications. Draeven crouched in front of her, close enough she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. The cost of maintaining absolute control. That's why this hurts, Lyra. Not because you betrayed me, but because you became exactly what I designed you to be. Something that could end empires with precision and intelligence. I just didn't account for you using those tools against mine. What happens now? Draeven stood. Tomorrow at dawn you'll be executed. Publicly, in the capital square, 50,000 people will watch you die. They'll see what happens to traitors, to weapons that turn against their makers, to anyone who thinks rebellion against my rule is survivable. And Varen? He watches. Then he's imprisoned for life. A living reminder that rebellion fails, that hope is weakness, that power is the only truth that endures. Draeven turned toward the door. Lyra's voice stopped him. Was any of it real? He paused. Didn't turn around. What? The strategy sessions. The late-night conversations about philosophy and power. The moments where you treated me like a person instead of a tool. Was any of it real, or was it all just manipulation? Draeven's shoulders tensed. What do you think? I think you're incapable of seeing people as anything other than resources to be utilized, which means no. None of it was real. His hand clenched into a fist at his side. You're wrong. Then prove it. Tell me one thing you felt for me that wasn't calculated for strategic advantage. The silence stretched so long Lyra thought he wouldn't answer. Then Draeven spoke, so quietly she almost missed it. Fear. What? I was afraid of you. From the first moment you stopped hesitating before kills. From the moment you started thinking strategically instead of just following orders. I was terrified of what you were becoming, because I knew eventually you'd realize you didn't need me, that everything I'd taught you could be used against me. And I was right. He finally turned to face her, to face. That's the only honest thing I can give you. The knowledge that you scared me more than any enemy I've faced in 20 years of war, because you were mine, my creation, and you chose to become someone else's. Whose? Your own. The door closed behind him, left Lyra and Varen in darkness. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, the old lord broke the silence. Tomorrow we die. Lyra tested her chains, found them solid, professionally installed. Looks that way. Any regrets? Lyra thought about it. Turned the question over in her mind. Thought about 6 years healing people who couldn't pay. 2 months killing for Garen. 3 years becoming Draven's perfect blade. 6 days trying to break free. Only one. What's that? I wish I'd figured out who I was before letting other people tell me. Varen nodded slowly. That's the trap, isn't it? We spend so long becoming what others need that we forget to ask what we need. Who we are when nobody's watching. What we'd choose if choice was actually possible. You think there's another version of us somewhere? One that made different choices? Maybe. But that version wouldn't have tried to change anything. Sometimes the only people brave enough to fight are the ones who've been broken badly enough to know there's nothing left to lose. Lyra closed her eyes. Then I guess we die brave. Night crawled past like something wounded. Guards came twice. Changed shifts, brought water but no food. Standard pre-execution protocol. Keep prisoners weak but conscious enough to understand what's happening to them. Dawn came gray and cold through the single high window. They heard the crowds gathering above. 50,000 voices eager for blood, for spectacle, for confirmation that the natural order still held and rebellion was suicide dressed up as courage. Soldiers arrived at first light, unchained Lyra and Varen from the walls, bound their hands in front instead. Just secure enough to prevent escape, but loose enough they could walk without assistance. They wanted the condemned to walk to their deaths under their own power. Better optics. They were dragged through stone corridors toward the surface, upstairs worn smooth by centuries of feet, past cells holding other prisoners who pressed against bars to watch them pass. Lyra's legs barely functioned. 3 days chained had left her muscles weak and cramping, but her mind was crystal clear, calculating, planning, looking for the angle that didn't exist. They emerged into the Capitol Square, and the noise hit like a physical force. 50,000 people pressed against barriers, screaming, jeering, throwing garbage and vegetables and hatred. A massive scaffold had been erected in the center of the square, 2 nooses hanging from a crossbeam, steps leading up to the platform, an executioner standing beside them wearing a hood that hid everything but his eyes. Lyra scanned the crowd with professional detachment, saw Draeven on a raised platform surrounded by guards, watching, face carved from something harder than stone. Their eyes met across the distance, and Lyra saw something in his expression that surprised her. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Emptiness. Like he'd won, but the victory tasted like ash in his mouth. The guards forced Lyra and Varen up the scaffold steps, rough hands positioning them on the platform. The executioner fitted nooses around their necks. The rope was rough, smelled like old hemp and older deaths. A priest stepped forward and began reading charges in a voice that carried across the square. Treason, conspiracy against the throne, attempted regicide, desertion, incitement to rebellion. A mixture of lies and truth blended so seamlessly that separating them would require more time than they had left. The crowd roared approval after each charge. Lyra looked at Varen. The old lord's face was calm, almost peaceful, like he'd made his peace with whatever came next. "Any last words?" she asked quietly enough only he could hear. Varen smiled. "Tell them the truth. It's the only weapon they can't defend against forever." The priest finished reading charges, stepped back. Draeven stood, raised his hand for silence. The crowd quieted like someone had cut their strings. He looked directly at Lyra. "Do you have anything to say before sentence is carried out?" This was it, her last moment of agency. Last chance to make her death mean something other than spectacle. Lyra took a breath, and spoke loud enough to carry across the entire square. "You came here expecting to watch traitors die, to see justice served, to witness proof that your king's power is absolute and rebellion is futile." The crowd murmured, uncertain. "But you're not watching justice." You're watching fear. King Draven is so terrified of losing control that he'd rather execute his most effective weapon than risk her thinking independently. Draven's expression hardened. Lyra continued, I served him for 3 years, killed for him, bled for him, became everything he wanted. And the moment I questioned whether innocent people should die to satisfy his paranoia, he decided I was expendable. Not because I failed, because I succeeded too well and started asking questions. She looked directly at Draven across the distance. That's what you are to him. All of you. Expendable resources. Useful until you're not. Loyal until you question. Human until you become inconvenient to his vision of order. The crowd had gone completely silent. He didn't make me a weapon. He revealed that he sees everyone as weapons, tools to be used and discarded. And if you think your loyalty protects you, if you think you're different, you're wrong. Eventually, everyone becomes a potential threat to absolute power, and threats get eliminated. Draven's hand moved toward his sword, but he didn't draw it, because the crowd was listening, really listening. And doubt was contagious. Lyra's voice carried across the square like a blade cutting through fog. So when you watch me die today, remember this. I'm not dying because I betrayed the king. I'm dying because I chose to stop being his puppet. That choice, that single moment of independent thought, was the only real treason I ever committed. And if thinking for yourself is treason, then every one of you is a traitor waiting to be discovered. She turned to the executioner. I'm ready. The executioner looked at Draven, waiting for the signal. Draven stood frozen, staring at Lyra. The woman he'd created, the weapon he'd perfected, the thing he'd loved in the only way he knew how, by trying to control it absolutely, and being terrified when control slipped. In that moment, he had a choice. Execute her, prove his power, maintain control through fear, or show mercy, risk looking weak, prove he was more than the monster she'd described. The crowd waited. Lyra waited. The Empire held its breath. And Draven raised his hand, not to signal execution, to stop it. The crowd erupted in confused noise. The executioner stepped back. Draven descended from his platform with movements that looked mechanical, walked across the square, climbed the scaffold steps, stood face to face with Lyra, removed the nooses. The executioner hesitated. I said remove them. They complied. Lyra stood there free, confused. The rope burns on her neck already starting to ache. Draven's voice was low. Only she could hear beneath the crowd noise. You win. What? You wanted to prove I'm a monster who rules through fear. You succeeded. Half this crowd is already questioning everything I've built. If I execute you now after that speech, you become a martyr. Your words live forever. The rebellion grows, so you win. Then why stop it? Because I'd rather lose the Empire than prove you completely right about me. He turned to face the crowd, raised his voice so everyone could hear. Lyra Voss and Varen Halk are pardoned. Sentence commuted to permanent exile. They leave the Empire tonight, never return. Anyone who aids them is guilty of treason. Anyone who harbors them forfeits their life. He looked back at Lyra. You get to live. I keep my throne. And we both know we destroyed each other in ways that will never heal. Draven walked away, left Lyra standing on the scaffold, alive, free, and completely untethered because she'd prepared to die with purpose, prepared to become a symbol. But this? This was worse than death. This was being erased without the dignity of martyrdom. This was mercy that felt like the cruelest punishment imaginable. The guards removed Varen's noose too. Same sentence. Exile. They were escorted from the capital that same night, given horses, minimal supplies, enough to survive maybe a week if they were careful, and told if they ever returned, execution would be immediate and public. Lyra and Varen rode north in silence as Blackspire's towers disappeared behind them into darkness. Ahead was nothing but unknown territory and uncertain futures. Finally, Varen spoke. What do we do now? Lyra didn't answer because she didn't know. She'd been a healer, a killer, a weapon, a revolutionary. And now she was nothing. Just a woman on a horse riding away from everything she'd ever been with no idea who she was supposed to become. The exile that hurts worse than execution. The mercy that tastes like defeat. The freedom that comes with nowhere to go and no one to be. And somewhere behind them in a throne room carved from black stone, Draven sat alone, staring at maps of an empire he'd just barely saved, by losing the only thing that had ever mattered. Not the throne, not the power, but the one person who truly understood him, and in understanding had chosen to walk away. That was the real defeat, not losing control. But realizing control was all he'd ever had, and it was never going to be enough. Exile lasted 3 weeks before Lyra understood what Draven had actually done to her. He hadn't shown mercy, he'd shown strategy. Because a dead martyr inspires rebellion, a living exile inspires nothing but pity. And pity doesn't build armies, it doesn't topple thrones. It just makes people feel better about their own cowardice while someone else suffers in the wilderness. That's what Lyra realized on day 21, sitting in a cave 50 miles north of the Empire's border, watching Varen die slowly from an infection that had started as a minor wound and spread like poison through his system. The old lord had taken a fall during their second week, gashed his leg on a rock. They'd cleaned it as best they could with limited supplies, wrapped it with torn fabric, hoped for the best. But hope doesn't cure infection, and infection doesn't care about noble intentions. Varen lay on the cave floor shivering despite the fire Lyra kept burning. His skin had gone gray. Fever made him delirious. He talked to people who weren't there, gave orders to armies that had surrendered weeks ago. "I'm sorry," he whispered during a moment of clarity, "for getting you into this, for believing we could change anything." Lyra dampened a cloth and pressed it to his forehead. "You gave me a choice. That's more than most people get. Some choice. Exile or execution. Better than just execution." Varen's hand found hers, gripped with strength that surprised her. "Promise me something. Don't make dying promises. They're bad luck. Promise me you won't give up, that you'll find a way to finish what we started, even if I'm not there to see it." Lyra looked at the old lord who'd risked everything based on principle and paid for it with his life. "I promise." Varen smiled, closed his eyes. His breathing steadied, slowed, stopped. Lyra sat with his body until the fire burned down to embers. Then she buried him outside the cave using rocks because the ground was too frozen for digging, stood over the grave as snow started falling, and made a decision that would either save her or destroy her completely. She was going back, not to beg for mercy, not to surrender. To finish the war Draven thought he'd ended by showing clemency instead of cruelty, because he'd made one critical miscalculation. He'd assumed exile would break her, but Lyra had been broken before, multiple times, by poverty, by assault, by becoming a killer, by becoming a weapon. Being broken wasn't new. What was new was understanding that broken things could still cut, maybe cut deeper because they had nothing left to lose. The journey south took 6 days. Lyra traveled at night, avoided roads, stole supplies from farmsteads, became a ghost moving through her own former empire. She didn't have a plan yet, just direction. And sometimes direction is enough when you've got nothing else. On the 7th night, she reached the outskirts of Blackspire. The capital looked the same, massive walls, citadel towers cutting the sky like broken fangs, checkpoints manned by soldiers who looked bored and cold. But something felt different, tension in the air, guards scanning crowds more carefully, wanted posters everywhere with new faces alongside hers. Lyra stopped an old woman selling bread near the outer market. "What happened? Why the extra security?" The woman looked at her suspiciously. "You haven't heard? I've been traveling. News travels slow in the provinces." The woman leaned closer, dropped her voice like she was sharing contraband. "There's unrest. Started 2 weeks ago. People questioning the king's judgment, saying if he'd execute his best weapon for thinking independently, what's to stop him from executing anyone? Protests in 3 districts. The king's locked down the city, arrested maybe 100 people. For what? For asking questions." Lyra felt something shift in her chest. Draven had made another miscalculation. By letting her live, he'd introduced doubt into a system built on absolute certainty. People saw him hesitate, saw him show mercy when his reputation was built on ruthlessness. And hesitation in an absolute system looked like weakness. She'd become more dangerous to him alive than dead, which meant he was vulnerable in ways he'd never been before. Lyra bought bread she didn't eat and melted back into the crowd. She needed allies. Resources. Information about Draven's current state of mind and defensive posture. She had none of those things. What she had was knowledge of the Citadel's structure, understanding of how Draven thought, and the kind of desperation that made impossible plans seem reasonable. Sometimes that was enough. She spent 2 days watching the Citadel from different angles, learning new patrol patterns, identifying weak points, mapping guard rotations. On the 3rd day, she saw something that changed everything. Cara Dane leaving through the eastern gate, alone. The younger woman looked different, thinner, moving with less certainty than before, like someone carrying weight that hadn't been there previously. Lyra followed her. Through the merchant district, into the slums where buildings leaned against each other like drunks, to a tavern that smelled like stale beer and broken dreams. Cara went inside. Lyra waited 5 minutes, then followed. The tavern was half empty. A few dock workers drinking wages they couldn't afford to spend. A prostitute negotiating prices with a merchant who looked ashamed and aroused in equal measure. Cara sat in the back corner, alone, staring into a cup of something dark. Lyra approached the table, sat down across from her without asking permission. Cara looked up. Her eyes widened, hand moved toward a weapon, then stopped. "You're either stupid or suicidal coming back here. Probably both." They sat in silence for a moment. Finally, Cara spoke. "I'm sorry. For the ambush. For turning you in. Don't apologize. You made the tactical choice. I'd have done the same." "Would you?" Lyra considered the question honestly. "A month ago, yes. Now I'm not sure." "What changed?" "I watched a good man die in exile because he believed people deserved better than living in fear. And I realized that dying for something beats living for nothing." Cara's jaw tightened. "You sound like a revolutionary." "I sound like someone who's done being a tool." She leaned forward. "Why are you here, Cara? In a tavern, getting drunk instead of at the Citadel, doing whatever Draven's newest favorite weapon does." Cara's laugh was bitter. "I'm not his favorite anymore. Not since I let you escape that fight in my safe house. You didn't let me escape. I beat you. You could have killed me. Should have. Draven knows that, knows you showed mercy. And mercy is weakness. So now I'm being phased out, fewer missions, more watching, being evaluated for reliability. Welcome to being human instead of a blade. It's terrifying." "Good. Terror means you're still capable of feeling something other than obedience." Lyra slid her cup toward Cara. "I need your help." Cara stared at her. "You're insane. Completely. But I'm also right. Draven's vulnerable right now. The city's questioning him. His absolute control is cracking. And if we hit him at the right moment, in the right way, we can break it completely." "We?" "There is no we. You're in exile with a death sentence. I'm a weapon being retired. What exactly do you think we can accomplish?" Lyra's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Everything he's afraid of. The plan was insane. Suicidal, really. But sometimes suicidal plans work because nobody expects them." Lyra laid it out over the next hour in whispers that barely carried across the table. The Citadel's command structure relied on Draven being untouchable, a figure of absolute authority who existed above normal human constraints. But he was human, which meant he had vulnerabilities. He had to sleep, had to eat, had to occupy physical space at specific times. And Lyra knew his routines better than anyone because she'd spent 3 years operating within them. Every 3rd night he inspected the Eastern Armory personally, checked weapon inventories, ensured readiness. It was a ritual he'd maintained for 15 years. He went with minimal guards because the armory was inside the Citadel's inner ring, secure territory. That was the opening. Cara listened without interrupting. When Lyra finished, the younger woman sat back. "That's not a plan. That's suicide with extra steps." "Maybe. But it's the only chance we get. Draven won't expect an attack from inside his own fortress. He thinks he's already won. Already eliminated the threat. His arrogance is the weakness. Even if we get to him, then what? Kill him? That just makes someone else king, probably someone worse." Lyra shook her head. "We don't kill him. We break him, publicly. Force him to face what he's become. Make him acknowledge that his methods have turned the Empire into a prison and everyone, including himself, into prisoners. And you think that accomplishes what exactly? It gives people permission to imagine something different. Right now, they can't imagine life without Draeven because he's made himself synonymous with order. We show them he's just a man, flawed, afraid, clinging to power because he doesn't know who he is without it. Kara was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was different, softer, more uncertain. Why are you really doing this? And don't give me speeches about justice or freedom. The real reason. Lyra met her eyes. Because 3 years ago he gave me a choice between dying as who I was or surviving as what he needed. I chose survival. And it cost me everything that made survival worth it. Now I'm giving him the same choice. Be who he is or maintain what he's built. See which he chooses when he can't have both. What if he chooses the Empire? Then we burn it down and build something better from the ashes. Kara absorbed that, then nodded once. I'm in. They had 2 days to prepare. Kara used her remaining access to map patrol routes and shift changes, identified which guards were loyal to Draeven personally versus just following orders out of habit. Lyra worked on contingencies, escape routes, backup plans for when the primary plan inevitably collapsed, because plans always collapsed. The question was whether you could adapt faster than chaos could kill you. On the second night, they met in the sewers beneath the citadel. Kara had smuggled weapons, light leather armor, tools for bypassing locks. She handed Lyra a blade that felt perfectly balanced. Miss this? Every day. They moved through tunnels Lyra had memorized years ago, routes the guards didn't patrol because they assumed walls and gates were sufficient. Assumption was weakness, and weakness was opportunity. They emerged in a storage cellar near the eastern armory, could hear footsteps above, guards changing shifts, waited in darkness for the right moment. It came at midnight. The patrol passed, footsteps fading. They moved, upstairs, through corridors, staying in shadows that felt like old friends. The armory was ahead, massive iron doors, 2 guards flanking the entrance. Kara looked at Lyra. Non-lethal? If possible. They approached from different angles. Lyra took the guard on the left, sleeper hold applied with precision. He went down without making noise beyond a soft exhalation. Kara disabled the right guard with a strike to the nerve cluster behind his ear. Professional, clean. They dragged the unconscious bodies into an alcove. The armory doors were locked, but Kara had keys. Inside was exactly as Lyra remembered. Rows of weapons, armor on racks, the smell of oil and metal. And at the far end, inspecting inventory with the focus of someone who found comfort in routine, was Draeven. He had 4 guards with him. Not enough to stop what was coming, but enough to make it complicated. Lyra and Kara moved like shadows. Took out 2 guards before anyone realized they weren't alone. The 3rd guard shouted an alarm before Kara's blade found his throat. The 4th managed to draw his sword before Lyra disarmed him with a strike that shattered his wrist. Silence fell, broken only by heavy breathing and the sound of a body hitting the floor. Draeven stood at the center of the armory, unarmed, surrounded by enough weapons to outfit a battalion, but not reaching for any of them, just watching Lyra with those ice-cold eyes. You came back. His voice was calm, like he'd been expecting this. Did you think I wouldn't? I hoped you wouldn't. Hope is a weakness I don't usually indulge, but for you I made an exception. Lyra stepped closer, blade in hand but not raised yet. Why exile instead of execution? Draeven's smile was tired, because killing you would have made you a martyr, but letting you live in obscurity would make you irrelevant. I thought removing you from the board was enough. Clearly I was wrong. You were wrong about a lot of things. Such as? That control is the same as loyalty, that fear is sustainable, that you could turn me into a perfect weapon and never have it cut you. Draeven nodded slowly. You're right, I was wrong. Does that satisfy you? No. What would? Lyra moved closer. Now they were 10 feet apart, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes, the lines that hadn't been there 3 years ago. I want you to tell them the truth. Tell who? Everyone. The Empire. The people you've ruled through fear and manipulation. I want you to admit that you manufactured threats to justify your methods, that you sent me to kill innocents, that you've built absolute power by making everyone too afraid to question it. And if I refuse, then I kill you here, now, and let chaos decide what comes next. Draven studied her face. You won't kill me. Why not? Because you're better than I made you. That's why you came back. Not for revenge, for accountability. You want me to face what I've done. Murder is too easy, too clean. Lyra felt something twist in her chest. Because he was right. She could kill him. Should kill him based on every tactical calculation. But killing him would make her exactly what he'd tried to create. A weapon that solved problems through elimination rather than transformation. So what happens now? Draven asked. You come with me, publicly. We go to the Capitol Square. You tell the truth in front of witnesses. You give people the choice to decide what kind of empire they want instead of imposing your vision through force. Draven's laugh was harsh. You think the truth sets people free? The truth terrifies them. They'll beg for someone to lie to them if it means avoiding responsibility for their own choices. Then let them beg. Let them choose their own chains instead of wearing the ones you forged for them. And if I refuse? Lyra raised her blade. Then you die proving you're exactly what I said you were. A tyrant who'd rather burn everything than surrender control. They stood facing each other. Creator and creation. King and weapon. Two people who understood each other too well and not enough. The moment stretched. Then Draven did something that surprised them both. He laughed, really laughed, like he'd just heard the funniest joke in his life. What's funny? You are. This whole situation. 3 years ago, I found a broken healer and turned her into the perfect weapon. Now that weapon is demanding I account for my sins. The irony is exquisite. I'm not laughing, because you don't see it yet. But you will. See what? That we're the same, both of us willing to do terrible things for what we believe is right. Both of us convinced our vision is worth the cost. The only difference is you're still young enough to believe there's a moral high ground. I learned that lesson decades ago. There's just ground. And the people standing on it making choices. We're not the same, aren't we? You came here to force me to confess, to make me face consequences. But you're doing it through violence and coercion. Same tools I used. You've just convinced yourself your cause is righteous, so the methods don't matter. The words hit like blows, because part of Lyra recognized the truth in them. She had come here with a blade, planning to threaten, to coerce, to force compliance through fear, exactly what she condemned him for. The difference is, I'll stop, she said. After this, after you confess. I'm not building an empire on fear, but you're starting one. And starting is the hardest part. Once you've crossed that line, once you've decided your vision justifies imposing it on others, there's no going back. You become what you fight. Then what's the alternative? Let you continue? The alternative is accepting that power corrupts everyone who touches it, including you, including me. And maybe the only honest thing we can do is admit we're all just people making terrible choices and hoping they lead somewhere better. That's not enough. It's all there is. Lyra felt her certainty fracturing, because Draven was doing what he'd always done best, getting inside her head, making her question, forcing her to see complexity where she wanted simple answers. Behind her, Kara shifted. Lyra, we need to move. Guards will have heard the alarm. Draven's eyes never left Lyra's. So what's it going to be? Force me to confess through violence? Kill me and prove you're no different? Or walk away and accept that some problems don't have clean solutions? Lyra's hand tightened on her blade. Every instinct screamed different answers. Tactical thinking said kill him now while she had the advantage. Moral thinking said force the confession and let justice run its course. But underneath both was something else. The knowledge that Draven was right about one thing. She had become like him. Not in methods, maybe, but in certainty, in willingness to impose her vision regardless of cost. And that terrified her. The door behind them exploded inward. Guards poured through, 20 at least, weapons drawn. The alarm had worked faster than expected. Kara cursed and moved to defensive position. Lyra didn't move, just stared at Draven. You planned this, the inspection, the timing. You knew I'd come. Draven's smile was sad. I know you better than you know yourself. Of course I knew you'd come. You're too stubborn to stay dead and too principled to let injustice stand. It's what I made you. This was a trap. No, this was a test, to see if you'd become what I feared or something better. And The guards surrounded them, weapons pointed. A commander stepped forward. "My king, are you injured?" Draven raised his hand. "Stand down." The commander hesitated. "My lord," I said, "stand down, all of you. Lower your weapons and leave us, but now." The authority in his voice was absolute. The guards obeyed, filed out of the armory looking confused but compliant. The door closed, leaving Lyra, Kara, and Draven alone again. "Why?" Lyra demanded. "Why dismiss them?" "Because I'm tired. So tired of being what this empire needs me to be. Of making decisions that cost pieces of my humanity I can't get back. Of ruling through fear because it's the only language people understand." Draven moved to a bench and sat heavily. Suddenly he looked old, worn down by decades of absolute power and absolute isolation. "You asked what I want. Here's the truth. I want someone to tell me it was worth it, that the empire I built, the stability I maintained, justified the cost. I want absolution from someone who understands what it takes to make impossible choices." He looked at Lyra. "But you can't give me that, because you've seen what it costs, what it took from you, and you've decided the price is too high." Lyra felt something crack in her chest. Not anger, pity, because she finally understood. Draven wasn't a monster. He was a man who'd made himself into a monster and then spent decades looking for someone to tell him it was necessary. And she was the one person who could see him clearly enough to refuse. "I can't absolve you," she said quietly. "What you did, what you made me do, that blood doesn't wash off. Not with justifications, not with necessity. It just stays there." "I know." "Then what do you want from me?" Draven stood, walked to the weapon racks, selected a sword, tested its weight, then turned to face her. "I want to see if the weapon I created is strong enough to end what I've become. If you can do what I can't, make the choice that's right even when it costs everything." He raised the sword. "Not in attack position. In challenge, fight me. No guards, no witnesses, just us. If you win, you take the empire. Reform it however you see fit. If I win, you die and this ends. That's insane. That's the only honest thing left between us." Lyra looked at Kara. The younger woman's expression was unreadable. "Your call." Lyra turned back to Draven, saw in his eyes something she'd never seen before. Not calculation, not strategy, hope. Twisted and desperate and completely sincere. He wanted her to win, wanted to be stopped, because he couldn't stop himself. And that was the saddest thing she'd ever witnessed. A king so broken by power that he needed someone else to end it for him. Lyra raised her blade. "All right, let's finish this." They circled each other in the armory. Two people who knew each other's movements like their own. Creator and creation, king and weapon, about to discover which one had become sharper. The first strike came from Draven, fast, precise, testing her reflexes. Lyra parried, riposted, forced him back. They'd trained together for 3 years, knew each other's tells, anticipated strikes before they landed. This wasn't going to be decided by skill. It would be decided by will, by who wanted survival more, or who was willing to let go. The blades sang against each other. Lyra felt her muscles remembering patterns, her body moving through forms she'd practiced until they were instinct. Draven fought with controlled precision, every strike purposeful, every movement economical. But underneath she sensed something, hesitation, not from fear, from hope that she'd be better than him. And that realization changed everything, because she understood. This wasn't a fight. This was his confession, the only way he knew how to admit he'd been wrong, by letting her prove it with steel. Their blades locked, faces inches apart, both breathing hard. "You don't have to do this," Lyra said. "You can just stop. Walk away. Let the Empire survive without you." Draven's smile was broken. "I tried. Every night for 20 years I tried to walk away, but power doesn't let go. It holds you until you're nothing but the role, until the man disappears and only the king remains. Then stop being the king. I don't know how. Learn." She pushed him back, reset her stance, and in that moment made her choice. She wasn't going to kill him, she was going to save him, even if he didn't want saving, even if it meant losing. Because that was the only way to prove she was different, to choose mercy when violence was easier. Lyra lowered her blade. Draven stopped, stared at her. What are you doing? Giving you a choice, the same one you gave me 3 years ago. Except mine is real. Pick up your weapon. No. Lyra, this isn't... You want absolution? Here it is. I forgive you. For what you did to me. For what you made me. For every terrible choice you thought was necessary. I forgive it. But forgiveness doesn't mean consequence disappears. It means we deal with it together instead of destroying each other. Draven's sword arm shook. You can't forgive me. You don't have that right. I have every right. I'm the one you hurt most. And I'm choosing to let it end here. Not with death. With transformation. Tears ran down Draven's face. Lyra had never seen him cry before. I don't deserve... Nobody deserves anything. We just make choices and live with them. Now make yours. She stepped forward, extended her hand. Come with me. Face what you've built. Help me fix it. Or kill me now and prove you're exactly what you fear you are. Draven stared at her outstretched hand, the sword still raised, the choice balanced on a blade's edge. Everything he'd built versus everything he could become. Power versus redemption. Control versus freedom. The moment stretched impossibly long. Then Draven's sword clattered to the floor. And he took her hand. The hand that took hers was shaking. That's what Lyra noticed first. Not the surrender, not the broken expression on Draven's face, but the tremor in his fingers when they closed around hers. 20 years of absolute control reduced to a hand that couldn't stay steady. That told her everything about what this cost him, everything about what it meant. A king doesn't surrender power. Power is ripped from his corpse or maintained until death. Those are the only options history teaches. But Draven was choosing something history had no language for. Abdication without death, transformation without destruction. And it was destroying him anyway. Kara stepped forward. Her expression was unreadable in the dim armory light. What happens now? Lyra kept her grip on Draven's hand, felt the tremors running through him like aftershocks from an earthquake that had shattered his foundation. Now we face what comes next. Together. The word felt strange in her mouth. Together. She'd spent 3 years operating alone even when surrounded by people. Being a weapon meant being singular, solitary, a thing wielded rather than partnered with. But that life was over, had been over the moment she chose mercy over violence, forgiveness over revenge. Now came the harder part, living with that choice. They left the armory as dawn broke across Blackspire's eastern towers, light cutting through darkness the way truth cuts through comfortable lies. Painful, necessary, inevitable. The Citadel was waking, guards changing shifts, servants starting their routines, the machinery of empire grinding forward like it had for 2 decades. Unaware that the engine driving it all had just shut down, Draven walked between Lyra and Kara, not as a prisoner, not as a king, as something else entirely, something none of them had words for yet. They encountered the first group of guards near the central courtyard, 20 soldiers in formation, the morning patrol. The commander recognized Draven immediately, snapped to attention. "My king, we heard reports of..." Draven's voice cut through the morning air, clear, certain in ways that contradicted the trembling hands he kept clasped behind his back. "Gather the garrison. Everyone on duty, central courtyard, within the hour." "My lord? Do it now." The commander hesitated for only a second, then saluted and moved. Within 30 minutes, the courtyard was packed. 500 soldiers, officers, administrators, everyone who made the Citadel function standing in formation, waiting for their king to explain why they'd been assembled at dawn without warning. Lyra stood beside Draven on the raised platform normally used for military honors and executions, Kara on his other side. 3 people who represented everything broken and everything possible about the Empire. The crowd murmured, confused, anxious. Someone recognized Lyra. The whisper spread like fire through dry grass. That's the shadow, the exile, the traitor. Why is she alive? Why is she standing with the king? Draven raised his hand. Silence fell like a blade. When he spoke, his voice carried across the courtyard. Not loud, but absolute in the way only decades of unquestioned authority could make a voice. 20 years ago, I took this throne through force and strategy. I built an empire on the principle that order requires control, that peace demands absolute authority, that stability is worth any cost. The crowd was utterly still. I believed those things, acted on them, shaped every decision around them, and they worked. The empire expanded. Rebellions were crushed before they started. Chaos was contained. Draven paused. Lyra watched his profile, saw the muscles in his jaw working, the effort this was taking. But I was wrong. The words landed like thunderclaps. Soldiers shifted, uncertain, their entire worldview built on the idea that their king was never wrong, that his judgment was infallible. Not wrong about the methods. Those worked exactly as designed. Wrong about the cost. Because absolute control doesn't create peace. It creates prisons. And I've spent 20 years building the most sophisticated prison in history, one where even the jailer is locked inside. He turned slightly, looked at Lyra. This woman standing beside me was my greatest weapon. I found her broken and remade her into something lethal and precise. I taught her to kill without hesitation, to choose survival over morality, to become the blade that cut down anyone I pointed at. Draven's voice roughened, and she became everything I designed, perfect, efficient, unstoppable, until she did something I never accounted for. She started thinking, questioning, choosing her own path instead of mine, and when faced with that defiance, I did what I always do. I eliminated the threat. He gestured to the courtyard, except she wasn't a threat. She was proof that my methods create temporary compliance and permanent damage. That ruling through fear means everyone is one wrong choice from becoming an enemy. That absolute power doesn't make you safe. It makes you alone. The silence was suffocating. So I'm making a choice I should have made years ago. I'm stepping down. The crowd erupted, shouting, confusion, officers trying to restore order while experiencing their own crisis of understanding. Draven waited for the noise to settle. When it didn't, Lyra stepped forward. Her voice cut through the chaos. Listen. Something in her tone demanded obedience, the same quality Draven's voice carried. Authority earned through surviving things that should have killed her. The crowd quieted. Your king is telling you the truth, not the comfortable version, the real version. He built an empire that works through fear and control. And fear works until it doesn't, until people are too afraid to function, too controlled to think, too broken to be anything except obedient. She scanned the faces staring up at her. How many of you joined the military because you believed in something? How many stayed because you were afraid what happened if you left? How many followed orders you knew were wrong because questioning meant death? No one answered, but she saw the truth in their eyes. That's what this empire has become. A machine that runs on compliance and calls it loyalty, on obedience and calls it strength, on fear and calls it peace. Lyra's hands clenched at her sides. I'm not here to destroy that. I'm here to transform it, to build something where strength means the courage to question, where loyalty is chosen freely instead of enforced through terror, where peace comes from justice instead of subjugation. And you get to choose whether you're part of that or not. No one is forcing you. No one is threatening you. You're free to walk away, to disagree, to build something different. She stepped back beside Draven. That's what real power looks like. Not making people obey, but giving them choice and trusting they'll choose something worth choosing. The courtyard remained silent for a long moment. Then one soldier near the front removed his helmet, set it on the ground, knelt. Another followed, then another, then entire sections of the formation. Not in surrender, in acknowledgement. Within 5 minutes, the entire garrison was kneeling, not to Draven, to the idea that something better was possible. That's when Lyra understood. The empire hadn't needed a perfect king. It had needed permission to be imperfect, to make mistakes and learn from them instead of pretending infallibility. And by admitting failure, Draven had given them that permission. The transition took 3 months. 3 months of dismantling systems built over 20 years, of releasing political prisoners, of redistributing seized assets, of giving provinces autonomy they hadn't known in generations. It was messy, chaotic, painful. Everything Draven had spent his life preventing, and it was necessary. Lyra worked 18-hour days establishing new governance structures, not centralized authority, but distributed power, councils representing different regions, systems of accountability, mechanisms for peaceful transfer of power. Things that felt fragile compared to Draven's iron control. But fragile and flexible often survived where rigid and strong shattered. Draven helped, not as a king, as an advisor who understood how systems worked and how to dismantle them without causing complete collapse. He was surprisingly good at it. Turned out the same strategic mind that built absolute control could be redirected toward building collaborative governance. He just needed a reason to try. Lyra found him one evening in what used to be the war chamber. Maps still covered the walls, but they were marked differently now. Not territories to control, but regions to support. Problems to solve through cooperation instead of force. He looked tired, older, but lighter somehow. Like removing the weight of absolute power had let him stand straighter even as it aged him. Can't sleep? Draven looked up, smiled slightly. Old habit. I used to spend nights planning, strategizing, ensuring every variable was controlled. Now I spend them wondering if I did enough today to undo yesterday's damage. You can't undo 20 years in 3 months. I know, but I have to try. Lyra sat down across from him. Why? You could have walked away. Let me handle the transition. Disappeared. Because running is what a coward does, and I may be many things, but I'm not that. He leaned back, the firelight catching the gray in his hair that seemed more pronounced lately. Besides, someone once told me that strength isn't refusing to fall. It's getting up after. I'm testing that theory. How's it going? Ask me in 20 years. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Finally, Draven spoke again. Do you regret it? Choosing mercy instead of killing me? Lyra considered the question honestly. Every day. But I regret a lot of things. At least this regret comes with hope attached. Hope that I'll actually change. Hope that change is possible. For both of us. Draven nodded slowly. I spent 20 years believing people were fundamentally selfish. That given freedom, they'd destroy each other. That control was kindness because it prevented chaos. And now? Now, I think I was projecting. I was selfish, destructive when uncontrolled. So I assumed everyone else was too. Built an empire around that assumption, and it became self-fulfilling because I created conditions where only selfish survival worked. That's remarkably self-aware for a tyrant. Reformed tyrant. I'm trying to earn the distinction. Lyra smiled. It's working. 6 months after Draven's abdication, Lyra stood in the capital square, the same place she'd nearly been executed. But the scaffold was gone, torn down. The wood repurposed for building housing in districts that had been neglected under the old regime. In its place was an open forum, a circular platform where anyone could speak, could raise grievances, could propose solutions. It was chaotic, noisy, inefficient, and it was working, slowly, imperfectly. But working. Kara approached from the crowd. The younger woman had taken to the new system surprisingly well. Turned out skills used for assassination transferred nicely to protective security when applied to defending people instead of eliminating them. We got a situation, she said quietly. What kind? The northern provinces. 3 lords refusing to accept the new governance structure, claiming it's weak. That strong leadership is needed. They're gathering supporters. Lyra felt her stomach tighten. How many supporters? Maybe 2,000. Mostly former military who miss the old certainty. And what are they planning? Nothing yet. Just organizing, talking, building momentum. Lyra took a breath. Then we talked to them. Find out what they actually want versus what they think they want. Address legitimate grievances. Explain why distributed power serves them better than concentrated authority. Kara raised an eyebrow. And if talking doesn't work, then we keep talking. We don't go back to solving disagreements with violence. That's the whole point. Even if violence would be faster, especially then, fast solutions to complex problems are how we got Draven's empire. I'm not interested in replacing one tyrant with another. Even if the other tyrant is you? Lyra met Kara's eyes, especially if it's me. The moment I decide my vision is more important than their choice, I've become what we fought to end. Kara nodded. Then I'll arrange transport north. We'll talk to them. As she walked away, Lyra felt someone approach from behind. Draeven. He'd been listening. You handled that well. Lyra turned. Handled what? The temptation. To solve a problem through force because it's easier than patience. I'm learning from a master of force who realized it wasn't actually easier. Just faster. Faster and easier aren't the same thing. Draeven smiled. No, they're not. I wish I'd understood that 20 years ago. You understand it now? That counts. They stood watching the forum, people debating, arguing, occasionally shouting, but engaging, participating in their own governance instead of waiting for orders from above. It's beautiful in a chaotic way, Draeven said quietly. That's what freedom looks like. Messy, loud, inefficient, and worth every frustration. He glanced at her. Are you happy? The question surprised her. I don't know. I'm not sure happiness is the goal anymore. What is? Purpose. Meaning. Knowing that I'm choosing my path instead of having it chosen for me. That's better than happiness. More durable. Draeven nodded. I envy that. I'm still learning how to choose for myself instead of for an empire. You'll get there. How do you know? Because you're here, still trying, still fighting to be better. That's all any of us can do. A year passed, then two. The empire transformed slowly. Some provinces embraced the new system. Others resisted. Conflicts arose and were resolved through negotiation more often than violence. It wasn't perfect, but perfect had never been the goal. Sustainable was the goal. Something that could adapt instead of breaking, that could acknowledge mistakes instead of covering them with more control. Lyra traveled constantly, mediating disputes, helping establish local councils, training people to think strategically about cooperation instead of tactically about domination. It was exhausting, but it was hers, her choice, her path, her purpose. Draeven stayed in Blackspire, worked with scholars and administrators to document the old system's failures, created educational materials explaining why concentrated power corrupted and distributed authority sustained. He was building something too, not an empire, a legacy of warning. They saw each other less frequently as time passed, their paths diverging as both pursued their separate visions of redemption. But when they did meet, there was understanding, recognition of shared history and shared scars. 3 years after the abdication, they met in the ruins of Raven's Hollow, the village Lyra had refused to burn, the place where her rebellion had truly started. Someone had rebuilt it, not to its original state, but to something new. Homes constructed from salvaged materials, fields replanted, life continuing despite every reason to give up. They stood in the village square as the sun set. I come here sometimes, Lyra said, to remember what I almost did, what I would have done if I hadn't chosen differently. Draeven nodded. I've never been here before. Couldn't face it, but I thought it was time. Why now? Because I'm dying. The words hung in the air. Lyra turned to face him. What? Old wound from the war that took the throne. Never healed properly. Physician says maybe 6 months. Maybe less. The news hit her harder than expected. Why didn't you tell me? Because there's nothing to tell. People die. I've made my peace with it. Draeven looked around the village. I wanted to see this place. The point where you chose to stop being what I made you. The moment my perfect weapon became a person again. You're not just going to accept this. We can find healers, treatments. We can. And it might buy me time. But time for what? I've done the work I needed to do, said what needed saying, made what amends I could. He met her eyes. I'm ready. Lyra felt tears she hadn't cried in years. I'm not. I know. But you will be. You're stronger than you think. Stronger than I ever was. That's not true. It is. I ruled through fear because I was afraid. You're building through trust because you're brave. That's the difference between us. They stood in silence as darkness fell around the village. Finally, Draeven spoke again. I need to ask you something. Anything. When I'm gone. When people tell stories about my reign, about what I built and what it cost. Will you tell them the truth? Which truth? All of it. The victories and the atrocities, the strategic brilliance and the moral bankruptcy, The man who built an empire and the man who learned to let it go. Why does it matter what they remember? Because I spent 20 years trying to control how history saw me, making myself into a legend, a figure too perfect to question. And it was exhausting, lonely. I'd rather be remembered as flawed and honest than perfect and false. Lyra nodded. I'll tell them. Every part. Even the parts that make me look bad for serving you, especially those parts. People need to understand how easy it is to serve tyranny when it's wrapped in order and stability. How seductive absolute control feels when it promises safety. All right. I promise. Draeven smiled. Then I can die knowing something true survives me. Draeven lasted 5 months. Not 6. He spent them writing, recording, documenting every decision and the reasoning behind it, creating a record of how absolute power corrupts and why distributed authority matters. Near the end, he was too weak to write, so Lyra wrote for him, transcribed his words, asked questions, pushed him to explain not just what he'd done, but why. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done, sitting beside the man who'd broken and remade her, watching him fade, knowing that part of her would die with him, not the part that hated him, the part that understood him. He died on a cold morning in his sleep, peacefully. More peacefully than he'd lived. Lyra arranged a simple funeral, no state ceremony, no grand monuments, just a burial in the Citadel Gardens with people who'd known him as a man instead of a king. She spoke at the service, kept her promise, told the truth, the good and the terrible, the strategic genius and the moral failure, the man who'd ruled through fear and learned to surrender through love. Not romantic love, but love of something larger than himself. Love of possibility that people could be better than his worst assumptions. When she finished speaking, she placed his writings on the grave, a warning to future generations wrapped in his own words. Then she walked away. Not running, not fleeing, just continuing. Because that's what survival meant. Not avoiding death, but living fully despite knowing it was coming. 5 years after Draeven's abdication. 2 years after his death. Lyra stood on the same ridge where she'd first looked down at Raven's Hollow, planning to burn it to ash. The village had grown, maybe 500 people now, thriving in ways that felt organic instead of controlled. She visited when she could, reminded herself why mercy mattered more than efficiency. Behind her, footsteps approached. Kara. The younger woman looked different these days, softer around the edges but harder in the core, like she'd found strength in vulnerability instead of violence. They're ready for you. Lyra turned. Ready for what? The council. They're voting on whether to officially dissolve the title of king. Make it permanent. They want your input. I'm not a council member? No. But you're the person who started this. Your voice matters. Lyra smiled. Then tell them I vote yes. Titles concentrate power. Power corrupts. We've learned that lesson in blood. Time to make it official. Kara nodded. And after? After what? After the vote. After the empire becomes whatever it's becoming. What do you do? Lyra looked toward the horizon, where Black Spire's towers were barely visible in the distance. I keep going, keep learning, keep choosing the harder, right over the easier wrong. That's all anyone can do. That's not much of a plan. Plans are overrated. Draeven taught me that. He planned everything and ended up imprisoned by his own control. I'd rather have direction than destination. Where's your direction pointing? Lyra thought about the question. Thought about 6 years as a healer, 3 years as a weapon, 5 years learning to be human again. Thought about Draeven and his empire, about Varen and his hope, about every person she'd killed and everyone she'd chosen to save. And she realized, forward. My direction is forward, not toward something specific, just away from what I was, toward what I might become. That's pretty philosophical for a former assassin. Former assassin, former weapon, former exile. I've been a lot of things, still figuring out what comes next. Kara smiled. When you figure it out, let me know. I'll help. They walked back toward the village together, 2 women who'd been weapons learning to be people. It wasn't easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was. But it was honest. And honesty, Lyra had learned, was the only foundation strong enough to build a life worth living. The council voted to dissolve the monarchy. Unanimous decision. The empire became a federation of self-governing provinces with elected representatives. It was messy, inefficient, subject to all the problems democracy always faces. But it was theirs, chosen freely, governed collectively, accountable to people instead of crowns. Lyra attended the official ceremony, watched as the crown was melted down, the gold redistributed to provinces for infrastructure, symbolic more than practical. But symbols mattered. They told stories about who people were and who they wanted to become. After the ceremony, Lyra returned to the small apartment she maintained in Blackspire's eastern district, not the Citadel. She'd moved out the day after Draeven's abdication. Just 2 rooms above a bakery. Simple, sparse, hers. She sat by the window watching the city move below. Thought about how far she'd come. From poverty to power, to exile to authority she'd never wanted. From broken to weapon, to broken again, to something resembling whole. The journey wasn't over. Probably never would be. But for the first time in her life, Lyra felt something close to peace. Not contentment. Peace was different than contentment. Contentment was satisfaction with circumstances. Peace was acceptance of self regardless of circumstances. And she'd fought too hard for that peace to ever surrender it again. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it. Found an old woman, maybe 70, face lined with years but eyes bright with intelligence. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled. "I'm looking for Lyra Voss. Was told I might find her here." "You found her. What do you need?" The woman held out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I'm from Raven's Hollow." "Was there the night you rode in planning to burn us? My husband was the old man you spoke with, the one smoking the pipe." Lyra's chest tightened. "I remember. He died 2 years ago, peacefully. But before he passed, he asked me to give you this. Said you'd understand when the time was right." The woman placed the bundle in Lyra's hands. "What is it? Open it and see." Lyra unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside was the pipe the old man had been smoking that night, carved from horn. Simple, beautiful. And underneath, a note written in shaky handwriting. "You chose life over orders, mercy over obedience, human over weapon. That's the hardest choice anyone makes. This pipe kept me company through hard years. Hope it does the same for you. You earned it." Lyra felt tears running down her face. "Thank you," she said quietly. The old woman nodded. "He wanted you to know your choice mattered, not just to him, to all of us. We're alive because you chose right, when right was terrifying." She turned to leave, paused in the doorway. "We're all just trying to be brave enough to choose right when it matters. You showed us it's possible. That's worth more than any crown." Then she was gone. Lyra stood holding the pipe, this simple object that represented everything she'd fought for. The right to choose, the courage to be merciful, the strength to be human instead of weapon. She sat back down by the window, lit the pipe with tobacco she didn't usually smoke, and watched the sun set over Blackspire, over an empire that was transforming into something better, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, but transforming. And she'd been part of that transformation, not by being perfect, but by being brave enough to fail, to question, to choose differently when different was terrifying. That was the real lesson. Not that heroes never fall, but that falling and getting back up is what makes someone worth following. Draeven had understood that at the end, too late to change his legacy completely, but soon enough to show that change was possible. And possibility, Lyra had learned, was the most dangerous weapon of all. Not because it destroyed, but because it built. And what it built couldn't be torn down by force or fear or absolute control, only by people choosing to stop building. Lyra had no intention of stopping. The Empire was transforming. She was transforming, both unfinished, both imperfect, both moving forward despite every reason to quit. And in that forward motion lived the only truth that mattered. Power wasn't permanent, control wasn't stability, and the strongest thing anyone could be wasn't a king or a weapon. It was a person, flawed, honest. Choosing right when right was hard. That was strength. That was freedom. That was the legacy worth leaving. Lyra took another draw from the pipe, tasted smoke and memory and possibility, and smiled. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't surviving. She was living. And living, she'd discovered, was the most revolutionary act of all. The story of the Alpha King wasn't one of conquest. It was one of a man who created the perfect weapon and discovered too late that perfection included the capacity to refuse, to choose mercy, to transform power into something sustainable instead of absolute. And the weapon he'd created? She became the thing he'd feared most, not his destroyer, his successor in spirit if not title. Someone who understood that real strength wasn't dominating others, it was facing yourself. All the terrible choices, all the blood, all the years of being something monstrous in service of something you believed was necessary, and choosing to be better despite knowing you could never be perfect. That was the revolution, not in governments or systems, but in souls. One person at a time choosing to be human instead of weapon, choosing to build instead of break, choosing to forgive instead of destroy, even when destruction was easier, especially then. The sun finished setting. Darkness fell across Blackspire. But in windows across the city, lights began to glow. People returning home, cooking meals, living lives they'd chosen instead of having chosen for them. And Lyra sat watching, not as a king, not as a weapon, just as someone who'd fought hard enough to earn the right to rest, knowing the fight would continue tomorrow. But tonight she could just be, and being was enough.